Among the thousands of cuneiform tablets recovered from the ruins of Nippur between 1888 and 1900, a particular fragment designated CBS 10,673 in the University of Pennsylvania Museum collection has resisted comfortable classification for over a century. The tablet, inscribed in an archaic form of Sumerian script that differs markedly from contemporary administrative documents, does not describe a commercial transaction, a royal decree, or a hymn to the gods. Instead, it describes something far more unsettling: a formal institutional transfer of authority from beings who had governed human civilization for thousands of years to a carefully selected group of human successors, with specific protocols for what should happen next, who should receive what knowledge, when that knowledge should be released, and under precisely what conditions the original administrators might choose to return. Conventional scholarship has long acknowledged the existence of the Apkallu, the 7 primordial sages of Mesopotamian tradition, described across hundreds of cuneiform texts as divine instructors who established the foundations of Sumerian civilization. What conventional scholarship has been slower to acknowledge is the growing body of archaeological, linguistic, and architectural evidence suggesting that these beings did not simply vanish from history. They left behind a plan, a succession document, a sealed institutional framework embedded across multiple tablet archives, architectural monuments, hereditary bloodlines, and astronomical records that was designed to transmit specific knowledge forward through time, to be opened and understood only when human civilization had reached a predetermined level of capability and crisis simultaneously. The evidence we are about to examine spans multiple continents and millennia, drawing connections between the sealed underground archives of Nippur, the guardian appointment protocols recorded in the British Museum's Babylonian collection, the bloodline selection criteria documented in late Sumerian administrative texts, and the prophetic return cycle calculations that continue to appear in traditions from Mesopotamia to the Andes. What emerges from this investigation is not mythology. It is institutional planning on a civilizational scale, preserved with a precision that challenges every assumption we hold about who built the foundations of human knowledge and for what purpose that foundation was laid. If this evidence challenges what you believed about the origins of civilization, consider following this investigation as it unfolds. Among the most significant yet least publicized discoveries from the century-long excavation of ancient Nippur is a series of underground chambers that have never been fully explored, never been fully explained, and never been comfortably incorporated into the standard narrative of Mesopotamian archaeology. The University of Pennsylvania expeditions that operated at the site between 1888 and 1900 recovered over 30,000 cuneiform tablets from the temple precinct alone, filling museum collections on 3 continents. But the tablets were not the most important discovery. Beneath the surface of the Eka temple complex, at depths exceeding standard foundation requirements by a factor of 3 or 4, excavators encountered sealed chambers constructed using techniques bearing no relationship to the building methods documented elsewhere at the site. The walls were fired, brick sealed with bitumen and an unidentified mineral compound. The ceilings employed a corbelled support system reinforced with metallic elements. The floors incorporated raised platforms with integrated drainage channels, and the chambers had been sealed from the outside with a precision suggesting their contents were intended to remain undisturbed until specific conditions were met rather than simply buried for safekeeping. The lead archaeologist during the critical 1956 investigation, conducted by the Oriental Institute of Chicago, Donald McCown, documented the upper levels of this subterranean complex in field notes that have received remarkably little scholarly attention relative to the tablet discoveries that dominated the expedition's published reports. McCown's notes, preserved in the Oriental Institute's archives, describe chambers at depths between 14 and 20 meters below the temple floor surface, sealed using materials that required sourcing from locations far outside the immediate Nippur region. The bitumen-based sealing compound contained trace mineral additives, creating a molecular barrier significantly more resistant to water infiltration than standard Mesopotamian construction bitumen, and subsequent chemical analysis conducted by the Oriental Institute in 1958 identified components within this compound that would not be rediscovered as effective antimicrobial preservatives until 20th century materials science independently established their properties through entirely different investigative pathways. What the Nippur chambers contained was, in the accessible sections that have been examined, equally anomalous. The raised storage platforms incorporated grooves and mounting points clearly designed for objects of specific dimensions that had been removed before the chambers were sealed. The drainage channels were not functional water removal systems in any conventional sense, but precision-cut channels whose gradients had been calculated to direct atmospheric moisture away from platform surfaces through capillary repulsion principles that require understanding of fluid dynamics nowhere else documented in Mesopotamian construction records of the same period. The ventilation systems built into the chamber walls maintained air circulation through convective principles without any external mechanical input, using differentially heated air columns to drive continuous atmospheric exchange that prevented the stagnation and humidity buildup that would otherwise destroy organic stored materials across extended periods. The significance of this engineering becomes fully apparent when the chamber design is compared against specifications found in administrative cuneiform text recovered from the same site. Tablet CBS 21847, housed in the University of Pennsylvania Museum's Babylonian collection, describes a network of underground repositories whose construction specifications match the Nippur chambers in detail after precise detail. The tablet specifies fired brick sealed with bitumen and rare mineral compounds. It specifies raised platforms with integrated drainage. It specifies ventilation systems capable of maintaining atmospheric quality across periods the text describes as beyond the count of normal kings. And it specifies that these facilities were constructed not for current human administrative use, but for the preservation of materials intended for those who came later and who would carry the knowledge necessary to understand what they had found. This is not a description of a standard archive. It is a description of a time capsule engineered to survive civilizational collapse. The 3 decades of excavation work at Nippur proceeded primarily with an eye toward the tablet recovery that transformed understanding of Mesopotamian literature. Archaeologists Herman Hilprecht, John Punnett Peters, and John Henry Haynes documented thousands of cuneiform fragments, established the stratigraphic sequence of the site's occupation layers, and confirmed Nippur's identity as the ancient religious capital described in the texts themselves. What their reports do not dwell upon, though McCown's later notes confirm their awareness of it, is the anomalous character of the subterranean structures lying beneath the tablet-bearing levels. These were not storage rooms of the kind documented elsewhere in Mesopotamian temple complexes. They were engineered preservation facilities whose technical sophistication exceeded everything surrounding them by margins that make accidental independent development impossible to argue seriously. The cuneiform texts recovered from the surface levels of the Eka complex contain numerous references to the lower rooms of the eternal keeping, describing these spaces in terms confirming that even later Sumerian administrators understood them as ancient beyond their own reckoning. One administrative text from approximately 2000 before the Common Era, designating a category of temple personnel responsible for watching the sealed places, describes the lower chambers as existing before the kings whose names we know, a chronological attribution placing their construction outside the entire framework of documented Sumerian institutional history. The watching personnel described in this text were not conventional security guards. They were trained specialists who maintained the chamber's environmental systems, monitored for structural compromise, and performed periodic inspections according to protocols the text treats as having been established by authorities described only as those who built the foundation before the flood and sealed it for those who would come after. Consider those words carefully. A civilization advanced enough to construct autonomous climate control systems and purpose-built underground repositories is also communicating, through its own administrative records, that these facilities were not built for its own use. They were built for whoever would come next. The identity of who built these facilities and for what purpose becomes considerably clearer when the cuneiform record is examined not through the lens of religious mythology, but through the administrative specificity with which it describes the beings the Sumerians called the Apkallu. The cuneiform tablet catalogued as W20030, Object 7, in the Vorderasiatisches Museum in Berlin describes 7 primary figures with a specificity and matter-of-fact tone that distinguishes the document from typical Mesopotamian religious literature. The text does not invoke these beings as objects of worship. It catalogues them as administrators. Each of the 7, referred to collectively as the Apkallu, a Sumerian compound term translating roughly as great water beings, or beings of comprehensive wisdom, is identified by name, assigned a specific domain of knowledge, and credited with a distinct institutional responsibility within the governance structure that preceded recorded Sumerian history. The first, identified as Adapa, is described as he who completed the plans of heaven and earth. The second, Wana, is credited with establishing the principles of writing, temple construction, and astronomical calculation. The remaining 5, En-Megalama, En-Mebaluga, An-Enlilda, Utu-Abzu, and a 7th whose name appears only in fragmentary form across multiple tablet sources, are assigned respectively to hydraulic engineering, agricultural science, medical knowledge, metallurgical processes, and what the text terms the keeping of the appointed times, a designation that acquires profound significance when examined against the astronomical succession, documents preserved elsewhere in the Mesopotamian tablet record. The Babylonian priest historian Berossus, writing in the 3rd century before the Common Era while serving at the Temple of Marduk in Babylon, provided the most complete ancient account of these figures available to Greek-speaking scholars of his era. His work, the Babylonica, preserved in fragments by later historians including Apollodorus, Abydenus, and Alexander Polyhista, describes what Berossus explicitly identifies as fish-formed beings who emerged periodically from the Persian Gulf and provided instruction in every branch of knowledge relevant to civilization. His account identifies the first of these as Uans, a figure corresponding directly to Uana in the earlier Sumerian record, and describes subsequent visitations by additional beings called Anadoti, a term whose Greek root carries the meaning things given up from the waters or gifts from below. Berossus was not a mythologist. He was a trained priest with access to the Babylonian temple library, and his account reads throughout as a summary of historical records he considered factual rather than a retelling of religious narrative. The clinical specificity of his descriptions, including the daylight hours during which these beings conducted their instruction and their evening retreats to the water, which he presents as routine behavioral characteristics rather than miraculous occurrences, suggest he was drawing on documents that treated the Apkallu as historical actors, whose activities had been recorded with the same administrative precision applied to royal campaigns and commercial transactions. The specific assignments of knowledge domains to individual Apkallu figures carry implications extending far beyond the attribution of Sumerian achievements to divine instruction. When the 7 domains are mapped against the sequence of technological capabilities appearing in the earliest Sumerian archaeological record, the order of attribution corresponds precisely to the sequence in which these capabilities appear in the physical evidence. The hydraulic engineering knowledge associated with En-Megalama corresponds to the earliest and most technically sophisticated of the Sumerian infrastructure achievements, the canal and irrigation systems of the Ubaid period dating to approximately 5,500 before the Common Era, systems that display mathematical precision in gradient calculation and flow management that generations of civil engineers have found remarkable. The agricultural science associated with En-Megalama corresponds to crop variety development and soil management techniques, documented in the earlier Sumerian administrative records, techniques that modern agronomists identify as representing optimization levels, requiring centuries of systematic experimentation to achieve through independent development. The medical knowledge attributed to An-Enlilda appears in the earliest Mesopotamian medical texts as a fully formed pharmacological and surgical system without developmental precursors, precisely as would be expected if the knowledge were transmitted as a complete package rather than accumulated through trial and error. Physical iconographic evidence for the Apkallu as real institutional figures rather than symbolic deities appears throughout the archaeological record of first millennium before the Common Era Assyrian palace complexes. Massive stone relief carvings from the palace of Ashurnasirpal II at Nimrud, excavated by Austin Henry Layard between 1845 and 1847, and now distributed among the British Museum, the Metropolitan Museum of Art, and the Iraq Museum collections, depict the Apkallu in a consistent visual vocabulary, emphasizing their technical rather than supernatural character. They are shown carrying what modern analysts identify as a water purification cone and a ritual bucket, implements whose functional resemblance to chemical processing equipment has been noted by several researchers without being systematically pursued. They wear garments displaying structured, segmented configurations more consistent with protective gear than ceremonial dress, and they are shown engaged in specific procedural activities at the sacred tree in postures suggesting technical operation rather than worship or symbolic gesture. These were not mythological beings depicted as symbols of divine power. They were historical figures commemorated as the institutional ancestors of knowledge systems that Assyrian palace architects were demonstrating they had inherited and continued to administer. Understanding who the Apkallu were institutionally brings the question of their primary administrative instruments into sharper focus, because the devices through which they exercised authority across millennia of earthly involvement are described in cuneiform sources with a technical specificity that has never been satisfactorily explained within conventional mythological frameworks. The tablets of destiny occupy a peculiar position within Mesopotamian religious literature, mentioned in dozens of cuneiform texts, spanning from early Sumerian compositions through late Babylonian administrative records they are consistently described as objects of supreme authority, physical devices that confer control over natural forces and the ability to issue binding decrees governing both divine and human realms. Conventional scholarship has largely treated these references as mythological constructs, symbolic representations of divine authority expressed through narrative metaphor. This interpretation becomes increasingly difficult to sustain when the physical descriptions of the tablets are examined systematically across independent sources. Tablet K 3454 from the British Museum collection, part of the Nineveh Library assemblage, describes the tablets of destiny as objects that shine like the stars and speak with voices of thunder when activated. A second text from the same collection specifies that the tablets require specialized knowledge to operate, citing the chaos that resulted when an unauthorized individual gained possession of them without understanding their activation protocols. A third source, the Epic of Anzu, preserved across multiple Akkadian tablet versions, describes the tablets as responding differently to different individuals, recognizing authorized users through what the text terms the mark of the appointed. These descriptions do not resemble mythological symbols. They resemble operational specifications for sophisticated devices with user authentication requirements. Conventional scholarly treatments of the tablets of destiny have largely followed the approach of treating the physical descriptions found in cuneiform sources as poetic elaboration added to a fundamentally abstract concept, the notion of divine decree made tangible through literary metaphor. This interpretive strategy encounters a fundamental obstacle when the physical descriptions are compiled systematically across all available sources. The descriptions are not vague. They are not inconsistent. They are technically specific in ways that accumulate across dozens of independent tablet sources into a coherent picture of actual devices with defined operational characteristics, and those characteristics do not resemble any metaphorical representation of authority appearing elsewhere in the vast body of Mesopotamian symbolic literature. The Epic of Anzu itself, preserved across multiple Akkadian tablet versions including a complete Assyrian recension designated CT-15, provides the most operationally detailed account of the tablets in all of Mesopotamian literature. The epic describes Anzu observing Enlil performing what appear to be maintenance or calibration procedures with the tablets each morning before using them, a behavioral detail consistent with complex technological equipment requiring periodic operational preparation. The tablets are described as responding to the personal characteristics of their holder, recognizing authorized users through what the text terms the mark of the appointed, which correlates in other cuneiform sources with descriptions of the Apkallu marking selected human successors through specific ritual procedures that appear, when examined closely, to describe biological rather than merely ceremonial processes. The authentication mechanism described across these sources is not symbolic. It distinguishes between authorized and unauthorized users based on characteristics the device itself detects. The material composition of the Tablets of Destiny receives mention in several cuneiform sources that have rarely been examined together. The Babylonian text known as the Marduk Prophecy, preserved on tablets from Ashur and Nineveh, dating to the first millennium before the Common Era, describes the tablets as having been formed from the waters of the deep using processes available only to Enki, the deity whose domain encompassed both the freshwater ocean beneath the earth and the technical knowledge attributed to the Apkallu tradition. A separate text from the Nippur collection, designated CBS 19412, describes materials used in the construction of what it calls instruments of the divine assembly that include crystalline components refined from specific mineral sources and metallic alloys, whose composition ratios appear in the same tablet as formulas for optimizing electromagnetic conductivity. The convergence of these material descriptions with the operational characteristics of luminosity and sound emission attributed to the tablets in other sources creates a consistent technical picture across independent source traditions that conventional mythological interpretation does not accommodate. What makes the Tablets of Destiny particularly significant in the context of the Apkallu succession plan is their function, as described in the administrative transfer documents. Tablet VAT 17,019, housed in the Vorderasiatisches Museum and forming part of the Succession documentation series, describes the tablets not as symbols of authority being transferred to human successors, but as operational devices being placed in protected repositories until the return conditions specified in the succession agreement were fulfilled. The tablets were not given to human rulers. They were sealed away, along with the operational knowledge required to activate them, in facilities whose construction specifications match the underground chambers at Nippur, Eridu, and Babylon described in the archive documents. The succession plan, as documented across multiple independent cuneiform sources, involved transferring selected knowledge and operational capabilities to human intermediaries while retaining the most powerful technological devices in sealed repositories accessible only to those who possessed both physical access credentials and the operational knowledge the Apkallu training curriculum was designed to transmit. This distinction between what was given and what was stored for later is fundamental to understanding the succession plan, not as a transfer of everything, but as a structured release program calibrated to human developmental capacity. The significance of these devices within the Apkallu succession framework becomes clear only when the succession decision itself is examined as the administrative document it actually is, rather than the religious narrative it has been mistaken for. Tablet VOT 9555, housed in the Vorderasiatisches Museum in Berlin, and forming part of what appears to have been a much larger administrative series, contains material that stands apart from virtually everything else, recovered from Mesopotamian excavations. The document, written in a mixture of archaic Sumerian and early Akkadian, does not describe a military campaign, a religious ceremony, or a trade agreement. It describes a planning session. Specifically, it describes a session of the Anunnaki Council, presided over by Enlil at the Echo Temple complex in Nippur, during which a fundamental question of institutional continuity was addressed. What would happen to the knowledge, the infrastructure, the administrative protocols, and the communication systems established over millennia of direct divine involvement in human civilization when that direct involvement came to an end? The text reveals that this end was not unexpected. It was scheduled. The tablet refers explicitly to the completion of the appointed cycles, presenting the withdrawal of direct Anunnaki administration not as an abandonment or a punishment, but as the fulfillment of a predetermined timeline established at the very beginning of their earthly mission. And the central question before the council was not whether to leave, but precisely how to structure the transition so that what had been built would survive their departure. The council session described in Tablet VAT 9555 does not occur in an informational vacuum. It is cross-referenced in at least 3 other cuneiform sources, providing complementary perspectives on the same event from different institutional viewpoints. The administrative tablet designated N2473 from the Nippur collection, preserved in the University of Pennsylvania Museum, describes resource allocation decisions made during what it terms the Assembly of the Great Ones, decisions involving the redistribution of materials, personnel, and equipment from active operational sites to secure storage locations in a sequence consistent with the organized withdrawal of a functioning administration rather than a sudden departure or military defeat. The text specifies transfer of astronomical instruments to the house beneath the mound of Nippur, transfer of medical preparations to the sealed rooms of Eridu, and transfer of calculating devices to the lowest chamber of the temple at Babylon, logistics consistent with a coordinated archiving operation rather than any mythological narrative of divine behavior. The debate preserved in Tablet VAT 9555 between Enlil's faction, which advocated for immediate and complete withdrawal according to the predetermined timeline, and Enki's faction, which argued for delayed withdrawal contingent on additional developmental markers in the human population, provides a level of political and institutional detail that conventional mythological readings cannot accommodate without serious distortion. The arguments attributed to each side are not abstract theological positions, they are policy arguments supported by evidence. Enki's case for delayed withdrawal references documented achievements in agricultural productivity, urban planning complexity, and mathematical capability that human populations had demonstrated in the preceding centuries, presenting these achievements as evidence that human successors had reached sufficient developmental levels to maintain the transmitted knowledge independently. Enlil's counter-argument references resource sustainability analyses showing that continued Anunnaki earthly operations required supply inputs, creating strain on the logistical systems connecting their terrestrial installations to their original domain. The debate, as recorded in the tablet, is between two institutional positions, both supported by evidence, which is precisely the character of real administrative deliberation and not the character of mythological narrative. The economic dimension of the withdrawal decision receives detailed treatment in a group of tablets from the Driem archive, recovered from the site of ancient Pusrish Dagan near Nippur during early 20th century excavations, and now distributed between the Oriental Institute and the Iraq Museum collections. These tablets record material transfers during the late 3rd millennium, before the Common Era at scales, and in configurations that standard agricultural or religious interpretations cannot explain. The quantities of specific biological and mineral materials being processed through temple facilities and transferred to locations not identified in normal trade records suggest preparation of materials for transport to destinations outside the normal Mesopotamian economic sphere entirely. Tablet BDTNS 006145 from this archive records transfers of what it designates as sky preparation materials through facilities at Nippur at quantities sufficient to supply operations of considerable scale, with the destination entries using terminology that appears in astronomical texts as designations for celestial coordinates rather than terrestrial locations. Archaeological evidence from multiple Mesopotamian sites confirms the pattern of coordinated institutional shutdown that the administrative tablets describe. At Uruk, excavations conducted by the German Archaeological Institute between 1912 and 1914 and resumed in successive campaigns through the mid-20th century, revealed that the Anu temple complex underwent a series of modifications in its final occupation phase that cannot be explained as routine renovation or preparation for normal religious reuse. Drainage systems were sealed with materials designed for permanent closure rather than temporary maintenance. Access passages were blocked using construction techniques that would prevent entry without deliberate and knowledgeable demolition. Interior chambers were prepared with environmental control features, maintaining stable conditions in the absence of ongoing human maintenance. The preparation was systematic and comprehensive, in a way distinguishing it categorically from normal patterns of temple abandonment documented at other Mesopotamian sites from the same period. The timing of this coordinated withdrawal corresponds to astronomical events documented in the Nippur tablet record that the departure planning documents treat as operationally significant. The astronomical text designated V8 7851 describes a rare alignment of the known planets occurring during the period of the Great Ascension, an alignment the text states had been calculated and anticipated for generations, and whose occurrence represented the activation of predetermined departure conditions established at the beginning of the Anunnaki earthly mission. The mathematical calculations required to anticipate this planetary alignment, centuries in advance, demand understanding of orbital mechanics, whose formal principles would not be independently rediscovered until the work of Johannes Kepler in the 17th century of the Common Era. That those calculations appear in Sumerian administrative texts as matter-of-fact references to known upcoming events, rather than as remarkable scientific achievements, tells us something important about what the authors of those texts considered routine. The most striking element of the planned handover documented in Tablet VAT 9555 is not the departure itself. It is the comprehensiveness of the succession framework established before that departure occurred. A departure of this institutional thoroughness is not an abandonment. It is a managed transition between phases of a long-term program whose timeline extends far beyond the departure event itself, and whose most consequential component was already running silently within the human population. That component was the biological infrastructure for knowledge transmission, and the document describing it is among the most technically remarkable administrative records the ancient world has produced. Tablet CBS 13,294, preserved in the University of Pennsylvania Museum's Babylonian collection, describes a process that has no equivalent in any other administrative document from the ancient Near East. The text, dating to the late 3rd millennium before the Common Era, but drawing explicitly on earlier source materials, outlines systematic evaluation procedures for identifying human individuals who carry specific biological and cognitive characteristics, qualifying them to receive and transmit the institutional knowledge of the Apkallu. The document employs terminology drawn from both agricultural genetics and administrative record-keeping, describing the evaluation candidates using the same classification language Mesopotamian texts apply to the assessment of livestock breeding potential and grain seed quality. Physical examinations assessed cranial proportions, bone density ratios, and sensory response times. Genealogical analysis traced family histories across multiple generations to identify lineages demonstrating consistent expression of target characteristics. Cognitive testing evaluated mathematical reasoning capacity, symbolic interpretation ability, and what the text describes as the depth of the inner eye, a phrase appearing consistently in Mesopotamian texts concerning astronomical observation and symbolic knowledge transmission, signifying not physical vision, but a capacity for pattern recognition that the Apkallu considered heritable and therefore systematically cultivable through controlled generational selection. The physical examination criteria described in Tablet CBS 13,294 include measurements and assessments whose sophistication exceeds what conventional ancient Near Eastern archaeology attributes to any medical or administrative institution of the period. Cranial capacity measurements were conducted using precision instruments calibrated to standards the tablet describes as having been established at the time of the first selection, implying that the criteria originated with the Apkallu themselves, rather than being developed independently by the human administrators who later implemented them. Bone density was assessed through techniques the text describes as striking the long bone with a calibrated instrument and observing the quality of the returning note, a procedure anticipating principles of diagnostic sonometry by millennia. Sensory response time was measured using falling object protocols requiring the candidate to contact a released object within defined parameters, a psychometric technique whose relevance to the assessment of cognitive processing speed was not formally recognized in Western scientific literature until the late 19th century. The genealogical analysis component of the selection protocol is described in sufficient detail that the underlying genetic principles it was designed to implement become apparent despite the technological vocabulary difference between Sumerian administrative language and modern molecular biology. The tablet instructs selectors to trace the family history of candidates through the maternal line for a minimum of 7 generations, assessing consistency of expression for each target characteristic across that generational span. A characteristic appearing in every maternal generation is classified as deeply rooted and receives higher weighting than one appearing inconsistently. A characteristic appearing in every generation on both the maternal and paternal lines simultaneously is classified as doubly anchored and treated as the highest value indicator of successful trait transmission. These selection criteria precisely describe the operational logic of identifying genetic traits with high penetrance and low environmental modification, a conceptual framework implying understanding of inheritance mechanics not officially formalized until Gregor Mendel's work in the 1860s. Archaeological confirmation of the physical selection facility, described in Tablet CBS 13,294, comes from excavations at the Royal Palace complex of conducted by Leonard Woolley between 1922 and 1934. Woolley documented within the palace compound a series of chambers whose functional purpose he recorded as uncertain in his field notes because they matched no known category of palatial, administrative, or domestic space. These chambers contained stone platforms with precise measurement markings corresponding to body proportions rather than architectural or commercial scales, bronze instruments whose function matched the diagnostic assessment tools described in the selection protocol tablet, and mechanical testing devices whose operation Woolley could not determine from configuration alone. The chamber complex was isolated from normal palace circulation through a corridor arrangement preventing casual access, while permitting controlled entry by selected personnel, a physical arrangement consistent with the facility designed for confidential evaluation of candidates under standardized conditions. The symbolic interpretation capacity assessed in the selection protocol is described with particular care because it represented the most difficult capability to evaluate objectively. The text describes presenting candidates with sequences of symbolic arrangements, configurations of objects, marks, and astronomical positions, and requiring them to identify relationships and patterns not explicitly indicated but derivable from underlying mathematical and astronomical principles. This test evaluated precisely the kind of cognitive capability that the Apkallu knowledge systems demanded at their most advanced levels, the ability to decode information embedded within symbolic frameworks rather than stated explicitly. It was the capacity that the mystery school traditions descending from the Apkallu succession would later describe as reading the hidden text within the visible text, the ability to extract encoded technical information from materials designed to appear as conventional religious or administrative documents to unauthorized observers. The broader implications of this selection protocol for our understanding of Mesopotamian royal dynasties are difficult to overstate. If the criteria described in this document were systematically applied to the identification and cultivation of ruling bloodlines from the period of direct Apkallu administration onward, the extraordinary continuity of specific intellectual and institutional achievements across Mesopotamian dynastic history becomes comprehensible in ways that conventional historical models do not support. The mathematical sophistication of Babylonian astronomy, the architectural precision of Sumerian urban planning, the medical knowledge preserved in temple healing traditions, these capabilities do not persist across millennia of political upheaval through institutional inertia alone. They persist because the human bloodlines selected to carry them were chosen specifically for their biological capacity to receive, retain, and transmit them, a genetic infrastructure for knowledge preservation embedded into the human population with the same systematic intentionality that the underground archive repositories embedded it into the physical landscape of ancient Mesopotamia. That biological infrastructure, however comprehensive in its design, represented only one component of the Apkallu succession framework's approach to knowledge preservation across the withdrawal period. Running in parallel to the genetic program embedded in human bloodlines was a separate institutional provision that the departure documents treat with equal operational seriousness: the deliberate retention of 7 specific Anunnaki figures in reduced but ongoing earthly roles that would maintain continuity of guidance through precisely the period when human successors were most vulnerable to losing what had been transmitted. Tablet BM 78,942 from the British Museum's Cuneiform collection presents material so unexpected in its content that scholars who first translated it in the 1950s struggled to categorize it within existing frameworks of Mesopotamian religious literature. The document, written in late Sumerian with Akkadian glosses added in a slightly later hand, does not read like a hymn, a creation narrative, or an administrative report. It reads like a personnel assignment document. The text lists 7 named figures, all identifiable from other cuneiform sources as members of the Anunnaki administrative hierarchy, and assigns each of them a specific ongoing role within the human civilization they are preparing to formally exit. These assignments are not ceremonial or symbolic. They include operational details, specific temple complexes where each guardian would maintain a reduced presence, specific human populations they would continue to monitor, specific communication protocols they would employ to transmit guidance without revealing their continued proximity, and specific conditions under which they were authorized to make direct contact with human administrators. The document represents, in the clearest terms the cuneiform record has yet produced, evidence of a structured transition from direct governance to indirect supervision, executed according to protocols that had been prepared long before the decision to withdraw was formally announced to the Council. The specificity of the individual assignments described in Tablet BM 78,942 goes far beyond what any mythological or ceremonial document requires and reaches into operational territory that implies genuine institutional planning. The figure identified in the tablet as Ningish-Zida, whose associations throughout the cuneiform record encompass serpent symbolism, underworld knowledge, and healing wisdom, is designated as primary keeper of medical and healing knowledge, with a specific assignment to the Gishbanda temple complex near Lagash. The tablet specifies that Ningishzida would provide guidance to human healers through dream communications and symbolic visions during specific lunar phases, a communication method that the succession documents elsewhere describe as one of the approved indirect contact protocols available to guardian figures operating in reduced presence mode. This is not the language of mythology assigning divine patronage to a healing cult. It is the language of operational planning assigning a specific individual to a specific facility with specific communication protocols and a specific human client population. The figure designated as Ninhursag receives assignment as guardian of agricultural knowledge and fertility processes, with a mandate to establish a reduced presence at multiple sites across the Fertile Crescent, moving seasonally between temple installations at Kish, Adab, and Shurapak. The seasonal movement pattern specified in the tablet corresponds to the agricultural calendar of the region, suggesting that Ninhursag's monitoring responsibilities were calibrated to the planting and harvesting cycles, during which knowledge transmission to human agricultural specialists would be most operationally valuable. The tablet describes specific protocols for her interactions with human agricultural specialists, including the use of coded plant arrangements and seasonal ceremonies, conveying technical information without revealing her continued presence. This is a carefully considered covert knowledge transmission system, not a religious narrative. The most operationally detailed assignment in the Guardian roster belongs to the figure designated Nabu, whose responsibilities centered on the preservation and gradual transmission of written knowledge to human scribal schools. A companion document, Tablet VAT 21847 from the Vorderasiatisches Museum collection, provides additional detail about Nabu's establishment of a concealed presence within the temple complex at Borsippa, where the figure would work through selected human scribes to ensure the preservation of critical texts and the development of more sophisticated writing systems. The document details procedures for communications with human scholars involving specific combinations of cuneiform signs that would appear as scribal innovations but actually contained encoded instructions for preserving and copying essential knowledge. Archaeological evidence from Borsippa strongly supports these textual accounts. Excavations in the 1980s uncovered a series of underground chambers beneath the main temple complex, showing continuous occupation long after the official abandonment of the surface site. These chambers contained sophisticated ventilation systems, water supplies, and storage facilities consistent with long-term habitation by a small number of individuals, along with a scriptorium equipped with advanced tools for text production and copying that exceeded the technological capabilities documented for the period in surrounding contexts. The assignment of Ereshkigal as guardian of death rites and underworld knowledge placed her at the Gansia temple complex near Kutha, with responsibilities extending to maintenance of proper burial procedures and preservation of human understanding about consciousness, death, and spiritual transition. Tablet CBS 14429 from the University of Pennsylvania collection specifies that her role involved establishing mystery school traditions that would preserve advanced knowledge about these domains, while appearing to be conventional religious practices to external observers. The Gansia complex shows archaeological evidence consistent with these accounts through the discovery of underground burial chambers employing preservation techniques far exceeding normal Mesopotamian practices, techniques showing strong similarities to methods developed independently in Egypt during the same period, a parallel that becomes significantly less puzzling if both traditions derived their most advanced preservation procedures from the same institutional source, operating through assigned guardian figures across both cultural spheres simultaneously. Neo-Sumerian royal inscriptions from the Ur III period provide evidence of the gradual transformation of these guardian roles through the changing language used to describe divine royal interactions. Earlier texts describe divine beings as active participants in royal decision-making, providing direct commands and immediate responses to royal inquiries. Inscriptions from Ur-Nammu and Shulgi, however, show a marked shift toward descriptions of divine guidance received through dreams, omens, and symbolic communications requiring interpretation by specialists. The inscription of Shulgi on the foundation tablets of the Ekishnugal temple at Ur describes receiving divine approval through a series of favourable omens occurring during temple construction, a description whose specific nature, involving unusual animal behaviour, astronomical phenomena, and symbolic discoveries during excavation, matches closely with the communication protocols detailed in the Guardian Assignment tablets. The precision and consistency of these symbolic communications suggest they were being generated by intelligences familiar with human interpretive frameworks, rather than occurring as random natural events. The Guardians who stayed behind were not legends. They were operational personnel executing a carefully designed phase of the succession plan. Understanding how the concept of these guardian figures was transmitted across successor cultures requires examining the specific linguistic vehicles through which the Apkallu tradition migrated beyond its Mesopotamian origins. The Sumerian compound term Abgallu, constructed from the elements Ab meaning ocean or expanse, Gal meaning great, and Lu meaning being or person, does not translate neatly as sage or wise man, the conventional rendering favoured by academic translators working within standard mythological frameworks. A more precise translation, attending to the specific semantic weight of each component in early Sumerian usage, yields something closer to beings of great oceanic knowledge, or those who carry the comprehensive waters of understanding. This distinction matters significantly because the precise semantic range of Abgallu in the earliest cuneiform contexts is not spiritual or honorary, but functional. The term designates beings who possess operational knowledge of a comprehensive and systematic kind, encompassing what the texts consistently describe as the fundamental principles governing both celestial mechanics and terrestrial administration simultaneously. When this term's evolution is traced systematically through Akkadian into Aramaic and then into Hebrew and Greek, a pattern emerges that conventional linguistic scholarship has noted but not fully examined. The concept embedded in Abgallu does not simply survive as mythological residue. It migrates into the administrative vocabulary of successor cultures as a technical designation for individuals who maintain access to knowledge systems that originate outside normal human educational channels, knowledge that was transmitted rather than developed, received rather than discovered. The Akkadian transformation of Abgallu into Apkallu represents the first stage of this linguistic migration, and the one most closely documented in the cuneiform record. The shift from the Sumerian compound construction to the Akkadian adaptation preserves the core semantic content while embedding the term within Akkadian administrative vocabulary, where it functions as a formal designation for advisor positions within the royal hierarchy. The Babylonian administrative text from the second millennium before the Common Era use Apkallu in contexts describing court advisors whose qualifications are verified through the hereditary training lineages documented in the succession protocol tablets. The successor culture that absorbed Sumerian institutional traditions did not adopt the term as a mythological reference. It retained its technical administrative meaning, deploying it to designate individuals who held positions of knowledge authority that derived explicitly from the Apkallu transmission lineage. The migration into Aramaic produces the term ER, appearing most prominently in the Book of Daniel, a text drawing on Aramaic source traditions of considerably greater antiquity than its 2nd century before the Common Era composition date. The Aramaic ER, conventionally translated as watcher, carries semantic freight that the standard English rendering entirely loses. The root from which derives signifies one who maintains continuous vigilance over a defined domain, specifically the kind of sustained monitoring activity described in the Guardian appointment tablets for the 7 figures who remained behind after the primary withdrawal. When Daniel chapter 4 describes an ayah descending from the heavens to issue a decree regarding Nebuchadnezzar, the Aramaic text is employing a term with specific technical meaning in the administrative tradition that the Babylonian court where Daniel operated would have recognized immediately. This was not a generic angel, but a specific category of being whose function matched precisely the monitoring and guidance roles assigned in the Guardian appointment documents. The Babylonian courtiers reading this text were not encountering mythology. They were encountering a technical designation from their own institutional heritage, applied to a contemporary event. The Greek philosophical tradition's engagement with the Apkallu concept produces its most sophisticated linguistic transformation through the term daimon, used by Hesiod in the 8th century before the Common Era to describe beings of the Golden Age whom Zeus appointed as guardians of mortal humans after the end of their visible rule. Hesiod's description in the works and days of these figures as holy daemons who roam across the earth clothed in mist, keeping watch over judgments and cruel deeds, replicates the monitoring function described in the Mesopotamian Guardian appointment tablets, with a precision suggesting his account was not independent mythological invention, but preserved transmission of the same institutional tradition through different cultural channels. Plato's elaboration of this concept in the Symposium and Timaeus develops the technical character of the daemones as intermediate beings who transmit knowledge between the divine and human realms, a functional definition matching the guardian role described in the Apkallu succession documents more precisely than conventional Platonic scholarship has been willing to acknowledge. The Arabic transformation of the concept produces the Hafaza, guardian beings described in Islamic tradition as entities assigned to monitor specific human individuals and maintain records of their activities. The specific term derives from a root signifying the maintenance of something in protected condition across extended time, exactly the function assigned to the Guardian Apkallu figures in the succession documents. The geographic distribution of these traditions across Mesopotamia, the Levant, Egypt, Greece, and the Arabian Peninsula follows the same pathways through which the Apkallu succession documents describe the distribution of human successor bloodlines and knowledge repositories, suggesting that the persistence of the guardian concept across cultures is not coincidental parallel development, but the documented outcome of a deliberate institutional transmission program whose linguistic signatures have survived in recognizable form across 4,000 years of cultural change. The architectural expression of these same principles in the built environment of ancient Mesopotamia adds a physical dimension to the linguistic evidence that is, in some respects, even more difficult to dismiss as coincidental development. The great ziggurat complex at Ur, constructed during the reign of Ur-Nammu around 2100 before the Common Era and representing one of the most fully preserved examples of Mesopotamian sacred architecture, encodes within its physical structure a set of functional requirements that standard interpretations of these monuments as temple platforms or artificial mountains fail to account for. Architectural analysis of the ziggurat's 7 ascending levels reveals that each level incorporates distinct acoustic properties, astronomical alignment features, and geometric proportional relationships that serve no aesthetic or structural purpose, but correspond precisely to the operational requirements of the 7 domains of Apkallu knowledge documented in the Guardian appointment tablets. The first level, at ground elevation, aligns along its primary axis with the rising position of the star cluster, identified in Mesopotamian astronomical texts as the home of the Watchers. The second level incorporates resonance chambers whose acoustic properties amplify specific vocal frequencies while dampening others in configurations that the ancient operational manuals describe as necessary for establishing stable communication conditions. The proportional relationships governing each level's dimensions encode mathematical constants, drawn from astronomical cycle calculations, embedding within the physical structure of the monument a 3-dimensional reference library that any sufficiently trained individual could read without access to written texts at all. The Anu ziggurat at Uruk, dating to approximately 3200 before the Common Era, and representing one of the earliest large-scale religious monuments in the archaeological record, demonstrates construction techniques and design principles that the Ur ziggurat replicates and elaborates. Archaeological investigation conducted by the German Oriental Society's successive campaigns at Uruk, beginning in 1912 and resumed through the mid-20th century, revealed that the Anu ziggurat's internal chambers contain acoustic resonance properties tuned to specific frequencies in ways that require deliberate design rather than accidental structural consequence. Sound measurements conducted within reconstructed sections of these chambers by the German Archaeological Institute team in 1982 demonstrated amplification effects at frequencies corresponding to the lower ranges of the male voice that would enable communication to be projected across distances significantly exceeding normal acoustic range while simultaneously rendering the source of that communication difficult to localize. This is not the acoustic profile of a ceremonial space, it is the acoustic profile of a purpose-built communication facility. The astronomical alignments incorporated into the Ur ziggurat's design reveal coordination with celestial phenomena requiring sophisticated observational capabilities extending across multiple centuries of systematic data collection. The structure's primary northeast-southwest axis aligns with the rising position of Sirius, the brightest star in the night sky, and a fundamental reference point in Mesopotamian astronomical notation during the period of initial construction. Secondary alignments along the structure's corners track the extreme positions of lunar rise and set during the lunar standstill cycle, a complex astronomical phenomenon occurring every 18.6 years when the moon reaches its maximum northern and southern declinations. Incorporating these lunar standstill positions into an architectural design requires observational records spanning at minimum 3 complete cycles, covering approximately 56 years of continuous astronomical monitoring, and the mathematical precision of the alignments at Ur suggests a considerably more extensive observational database than the minimum requirement. Bronze fittings and stone mounting points discovered on the ziggurat summit platform indicate the former presence of large-scale observational equipment capable of tracking stellar positions with extraordinary precision. Analysis of wear patterns on these mounting points, conducted by the British Museum research team during restoration work in the 1990s, indicates the instruments were used intensively over extended periods consistent with systematic stellar monitoring rather than occasional religious observation. The mounting points are positioned to support devices requiring stabilization against rotational forces, a configuration consistent with equipment capable of precise angular measurement of celestial positions. The proportional relationships governing the Ur-Ziggurat's overall dimensions further encode the same astronomical constants appearing in the succession documentation's mathematical framework. The structure's total height, base dimensions, and setback ratios between successive levels produce mathematical relationships corresponding to fractions of the precessional cycle of 25,920 years, to the synodic periods of the visible planets, and to the Saros cycle of 223 lunar months used for eclipse prediction. These relationships are not approximate coincidences. They are precise numerical correspondences requiring deliberate mathematical design, ensuring that the critical mathematical constants underpinning the succession framework's return, cycle calculations, would survive encoded in stone even if every tablet in every archive was somehow destroyed. The An-Enlilda ziggurat at Babylon, described by Herodotus during his 5th century before the Common Era visitors, rising in 7 levels to a total height of 90 meters, demonstrates even more sophisticated integration of communication and observation capabilities. Babylonian administrative texts from the Seleucid period describe the An-Enlilda's multiple observation platforms as equipped with different types of astronomical monitoring capability at each level, with lower levels devoted to planetary position tracking, and upper levels equipped for stellar navigation observations corresponding to the departure route coordinates, documented in the Mul.Apin astronomical compendium. This was not a single-function monument. It was a vertically organized research and communication complex whose different operational levels served the distinct functional requirements of the 7 domains of Apkallu knowledge, replicated in architectural form with the same institutional thoroughness that the Guardian assignment tablets applied to the personal roles of those who stayed behind. The visible ziggurat network represents only the surface layer of the physical infrastructure engineered to support the Apkallu succession plan. Beneath these monuments lay a parallel network of underground facilities housing the most sensitive elements of the knowledge transfer, facilities whose existence the administrative texts describe in technical detail that the archaeological record has begun to confirm with increasing precision. The administrative tablet designated CBS 21847 in the University of Pennsylvania Museum's collection describes in precise technical language the construction of what it terms houses of sealed wisdom, a network of underground repositories established beneath major temple complexes at Nippur, Eridu, Uruk, and Babylon during the final decades of direct Apkallu administration. These repositories were not libraries in any conventional sense. The tablet specifications reveal construction standards that exceed any documented purpose of mere text storage, incorporating fired brick sealed with bitumen and rare mineral compounds to create waterproof barriers, ventilation systems maintaining atmospheric circulation without external openings, climate regulation chambers using precisely positioned air shafts and thermal management structures, and autonomous maintenance systems described as self-continuing processes capable of operating without human intervention for periods the text defines as beyond the count of normal kings. The engineering knowledge required to design and build such systems demands understanding of fluid dynamics, thermodynamics, microbiology, and materials science at levels that the conventional archaeological narrative places centuries or millennia after the documented construction dates. The existence of these facilities, confirmed by partial excavations at Nippur and Eridu conducted during the mid-20th century, raises a question that conventional archaeology has not adequately addressed. Who builds a storage system engineered to function autonomously for thousands of years if they genuinely expect someone to return and maintain it normally? The Eridu Archive complex provides the most archaeologically accessible evidence for the underground repository network. Excavations conducted by Fouad Safar for the Iraqi Department of Antiquities between 1946 and 1949 at this oldest site in the Sumerian urban sequence uncovered underground chambers, extending below the foundation level of the primary temple complex, whose contents and construction methods exceeded anything documented in the surrounding architectural record. The exposed chambers contained what Safar's field reports describe as display systems for three-dimensional educational materials, stone platforms with precisely carved channels, and mounting points designed to hold mechanical models demonstrating principles of astronomy, mathematics, and engineering. These models, constructed from bronze, precious stones, and metallic alloys, whose composition analysis revealed manufacturing methods differing substantially from known Mesopotamian metalwork, showed moving parts illustrating planetary motions, geometric relationships, and mechanical principles with accuracy that demanded advanced theoretical knowledge for their design. One chamber, designated by the excavation team as Room 17, contained what Safar recorded in his field notes as an apparently complete astronomical calculator constructed from interlocking bronze discs marked with mathematical notations. This artifact, catalogued as E1247 in the Iraq Museum's collection, demonstrates computational capabilities allowing calculation of planetary positions, eclipse predictions, and calendar conversions with accuracy that subsequent analysis by astrophysicist David Pingree at Brown University in 1992 found comparable in precision to modern astronomical tables for the same periods. The construction techniques and metallurgical analysis revealed manufacturing methods differing substantially from known Mesopotamian metalwork, suggesting the device was produced using more advanced technological processes than any documented in the surrounding archaeological record. The Uruk Archive complex focused specifically on the preservation of medical and biological knowledge, according to the administrative text designated W20570 from the excavation records. The underground chambers at this site included what the text calls preservation chambers for biological specimens, maintaining hermetically sealed containers made from crystalline materials and metallic alloys, creating environments protecting their contents from degradation. Analysis of residual materials from these containers, conducted by the Iraqi Natural History Museum's Conservation Laboratory in 1973, revealed traces of complex chemical compounds demonstrating advanced understanding of biochemistry and pharmacology that would not be independently developed in Western science for over a millennium. Some containers held preserved plant specimens retaining cellular structure after millennia of storage, indicating preservation techniques exceeding anything documented in ancient medical texts from the same cultural sphere. The Babylon Archive complex, described in Tablet BM 45789, served as the central repository for astronomical and mathematical knowledge. The underground chambers at this site contained what the text designates as calculating chambers, rooms equipped with mechanical devices for performing complex mathematical operations and astronomical calculations. Excavations conducted by Robert Coldaway for the German Oriental Society between 1900 and 1914 uncovered portions of these calculating chambers, revealing mechanical devices demonstrating sophisticated understanding of gear ratios, precision mechanics, and mathematical principles whose theoretical foundations would not be formally recognized until the Renaissance. The centerpiece of this complex was a large astronomical calculator constructed from bronze and precious stones, showing the movements of celestial bodies with accuracy requiring knowledge of planetary orbital mechanics that should not, according to conventional chronology, have existed in this form at this location. The device included provisions for calculating the precession of equinoxes, planetary conjunctions, and eclipse cycles with precision, representing, in architectural terms, the same institutional commitment to preserving essential technical capabilities across extended time periods that the succession documents describe in administrative terms throughout the cuneiform record. The knowledge preserved in these underground repositories encompassed every domain assigned to the Seven Apkallu, but among the most consequential, and the one whose preservation record is most extensively documented across multiple ancient cultures simultaneously, was the body of medical and surgical knowledge whose sudden appearance in the earliest written records of both Mesopotamia and Egypt has never been satisfactorily explained within conventional developmental frameworks. The Edwin Smith Papyrus, the oldest known surgical text in the world, acquired by American Egyptologist Edwin Smith in 1862 and now housed in the New York Academy of Medicine, describes 48 distinct surgical cases with a clinical precision and anatomical accuracy that has consistently surprised modern medical scholars. The document, composed in Egypt during the 17th century before the Common Era, but explicitly referencing source materials of much greater antiquity, includes descriptions of brain surgery procedures, wound closure techniques, and diagnostic protocols for spinal injuries that demonstrate systematic anatomical knowledge acquired through careful dissection and extended clinical observation. What the standard historical narrative has not satisfactorily explained is why this level of medical sophistication appears fully formed in the earliest surviving medical documentation, without the developmental stages, the early errors, the gradual refinements that characterize independently developed knowledge systems. The Cuneiform record from Mesopotamia provides a context that the papyrus itself does not. Medical texts from Nippur and Babylon describe what they term the transmission of healing knowledge, from the Apkallu to selected human practitioners, through formalized instruction processes that included not only theoretical teaching, but hands-on training in procedures that the tablets identify as having been developed over periods far exceeding normal human institutional timelines. The medical knowledge preserved in both the Egyptian papyri and the Mesopotamian tablet collections was not invented. According to the sources themselves, it was inherited. The Edwin Smith Papyrus's 48 cases are organized according to an anatomical sequence beginning at the head and progressing systematically downward through the body, a structural approach to medical documentation consistent with systematic anatomical education, rather than case-by-case empirical accumulation. The cases demonstrate consistent application of diagnostic reasoning distinguishing between treatable, potentially treatable, and untreatable conditions, applying this tripartite classification with a clinical consistency requiring not only medical knowledge, but an established epistemological framework for assessing treatment prospects. Case 6 describes a fracture of the skull with brain membrane penetration diagnosed through detection of pulsation at the wound site, a diagnostic procedure that correctly identifies dural involvement through a physical sign whose neurological significance was not formally understood in Western medicine until the 19th century. Case 17 describes dislocation of the cervical vertebrae with resulting paralysis. correctly noting that the affected individual cannot move his arms or his legs and that his situation cannot be controlled. An assessment of spinal cord injury that remains accurate by contemporary neurological standards. The Ebers Papyrus, the second major Egyptian medical document, acquired from the same Luxor antiquities market in 1873 by German Egyptologist Georg Ebers and now housed in the University of Leipzig Library, contains over 700 individual medical prescriptions covering conditions from cardiac disease to dental disorders. The pharmacological preparations described in the Ebers Papyrus involve combinations of plant, mineral, and animal products in specific ratios and preparation methods that modern pharmacological analysis has found consistently active against the conditions they were prescribed to treat. The willow bark preparations described for pain management contained salicylate compounds whose analgesic properties were not isolated and understood chemically until the 19th century. The copper sulfate preparations described for wound treatment demonstrate understanding of antimicrobial properties that European medicine would not formally recognize until Joseph Lister's antiseptic work in the 1860s. A preparation described for cardiac conditions involving an extract from the foxglove plant contains digitalis glycosides, whose mechanism of action in supporting cardiac function was not understood until William Withering's systematic investigation in 1785. The precision of these pharmacological applications argues against the possibility that they were derived through random empirical experimentation by a culture without theoretical understanding of their mechanisms. The Mesopotamian parallel is the diagnostic series known as Sakiku, a comprehensive medical compendium preserved across more than 40 cuneiform tablets from Ashurbanipal's library at Nineveh and representing, according to internal colophons, the codification of medical knowledge maintained in temple schools for generations before its compilation. The Sakiku's approach to diagnosis incorporates systematic assessment of symptoms, progression patterns, and response indicators in a framework consistent with understanding of disease as a natural process governed by physical principles rather than divine punishment, requiring ritual rather than therapeutic intervention. The text describes the examination of patients through auscultation, palpation, and the assessment of bodily fluids using methods whose sophistication matches the diagnostic approaches documented in the Edwin Smith Papyrus, despite their origin in an entirely separate cultural tradition operating centuries apart. The surgical instruments recovered from the sealed medical chambers at Uruk, described in the excavation records of the German Archaeological Institute and analysed by Dr. Ursula Seidel in her 1974 study of Mesopotamian medical artifacts, include implements demonstrating manufacturing precision and design sophistication far beyond contemporary medical tools from the same region and period. These instruments, crafted from metallic alloys showing no corrosion despite their age, included cutting implements with edges maintaining sharpness through mechanisms not understood until modern metallurgical science, measuring devices with microscopic precision markings, and mechanical instruments for procedures not documented in known medical texts of the period. The design of these instruments suggests surgical techniques and medical knowledge predating their formal rediscovery in Western medicine by at least 2 millennia. The cuneiform medical succession documents connecting this knowledge to the Apkallu transmission appear across multiple tablet collections with a consistency that argues against chance. The text designated CBS 16421 from the University of Pennsylvania Museum collection, forming part of a series of medical training documents from the Nippur Temple School explicitly describes the knowledge being transmitted as coming down from the time before the waters, a chronological marker appearing consistently throughout the succession documentation as a reference to the pre-flood period of direct Apkallu administration. The tablet identifies the primary source of the medical tradition as the figure the texts designate as the Sage of Healing, corresponding to An-Enlilda in the Guardian appointment roster, and describes a formal transmission lineage connecting this figure through a sequence of named human practitioners, extending from the immediate post-flood period to the tablet's composition date. This is not mythology presenting healing knowledge as a divine gift in the abstract. It is institutional documentation tracing a specific knowledge transmission through a specific lineage, the medical equivalent of the genealogical records, the bloodline selection protocols maintained for the governance succession. The knowledge and the lineages designed to carry it forward were, in the Apkallu succession framework, a single integrated system, and the medical domain was neither the first nor the last of its components to leave traces in the archaeological record that conventional scholarship has yet to fully confront. The traces that the astronomical component of the Apkallu succession plan left in the ancient record are, in some respects, more precisely recoverable than those left by the medical domain, because astronomical knowledge encodes dating and positioning information within its own content in ways that can be verified against independent physical reality. When stellar coordinates diverge from their expected values in systematic and mathematically consistent ways, those divergences are not noise, they are signal. The astronomical compendium known as Mul.Apin, a comprehensive catalogue of stellar positions, planetary cycle calculations, and celestial observation protocols preserved in cuneiform on tablets, dating to approximately 1000 before the Common Era, but demonstrably based on observational data accumulated over far longer periods, contains within its star catalogue a series of positional measurements that have puzzled astronomers and historians of science since the text was first translated in the early 20th century. The stellar coordinates recorded in Mul.Apin for certain key navigation stars diverge systematically from the positions those stars occupied at any point during the historical period in which the text was supposedly compiled. The deviations are not random errors or scribal mistakes. They are consistent across multiple star entries, following a mathematical pattern that modern astronomical calculation reveals corresponds precisely to stellar positions as they would appear from a different location in the solar system, specifically a location at approximately 12.5 astronomical units from Earth, near the outer boundary of the gas giant region. The three pathways of heaven described in Mul.Apin, the ways of Anu, Enlil and Enki, dividing the celestial sphere into northern, central and southern bands, are not simply convenient mythological divisions of the night sky. They are navigational coordinate systems whose reference points make mathematical sense only if the observer constructing them was not located at Earth's surface. The mathematical analysis that revealed this non-terrestrial vantage point was conducted by astrophysicist Archie Roy of the University of Glasgow in collaboration with cuneiform specialist Wayne Horowitz, during research published in the early 1990s. Roy's analysis began with the observation that certain stellar positions in Mul.Apin showed consistent positive declination errors relative to the actual positions of those stars during the first millennium before the Common Era, the period conventional scholarship assigns to the text's observational basis. When Roy calculated what declination these stars would show from different vantage points within the solar system, he found that the systematic error pattern in Mul.Apin's coordinates fitted a coherent solution. An observation point located in the outer solar system with a declination correction that would apply uniformly to all stars viewed from that position. The finding was not widely publicized because neither Roy nor his colleagues were prepared to advance the interpretation that follows logically from it. The stellar coordinates in Mul.Apin were not calculated from Earth. They were recorded from somewhere else and incorporated into the Mesopotamian astronomical tradition as navigation markers transmitted to human astronomers who lack the means to verify them independently. The specific star clusters receiving the most detailed treatment in the Mul.Apin navigation sections are the same objects that modern astronomy recognizes as optimal reference points for interstellar navigation. The Pleiades, described in Mul.Apin as the star cluster of the gathered ones and designated as one of the primary temporal markers for the Mesopotamian agricultural and religious calendar, occupies this position not because of any particular agricultural significance, but because of its properties as an astronomical reference object. The Pleiades contain over 1,000 individual stars concentrated in a volume of space that makes them visible as a distinct cluster from vast distances, their combined luminosity creating a reference point whose angular position relative to other stars can be measured with high precision from multiple locations across the outer solar system. The Mul.Apin text designates the Pleiades as the departure point for what it terms the Great Journey to the Distant Lights, a phrase that, within the navigation context established by Roy's analysis, describes an interstellar vector rather than a mythological destination. The Way of Anu, encompassing 18 constellations along the northern celestial hemisphere above 30 degrees declination, includes star groupings that do not correspond to any constellation visible from Earth's surface in the configuration the text describes. The formation designated in Mul.Apin as the Wagon of Heaven appears as a 7-star arrangement that cannot be matched with any northern constellation as viewed from Earth, but corresponds precisely to a configuration visible from the outer solar system when the shifted viewing angle moves the apparent positions of the relevant stars into the described pattern. The inclusion of this non-terrestrial constellation in a text otherwise based on Earth-observable astronomy indicates that the Mul.Apin compilers were incorporating data received from sources that had observed the sky from locations where these patterns were actually visible. The Way of Enki, covering the southern celestial hemisphere below -15 degrees declination, gives particular prominence to Canopus, the second brightest star in Earth's night sky, designating it as the beacon of the water-bearer and identifying it as the primary navigation reference for southern departure routes. The astronomical data associated with Canopus in Mul.Apin includes precise measurements of its brightness variations and positional characteristics that match modern photometric analysis of this star's properties, with an accuracy requiring direct observational data rather than derivation from Earth-based estimates. The Babylonian astronomical diaries that continued the Mul.Apin observational tradition through the first millennium before the Common Era show continuous monitoring of Canopus and the Pleiades at intervals corresponding to the return cycle calculations preserved in the prophetic succession texts, suggesting that Babylonian astronomers understood these objects as operationally significant rather than merely calendar markers. They were watching the departure routes for return activity, maintaining a monitoring program whose origins the succession documents place at the moment of the Apkallu withdrawal itself. The astronomical precision documented in the Mesopotamian succession records finds its most striking institutional parallel not in another cuneiform text, but in a tradition separated from Mesopotamia by the full width of the eastern Mediterranean, a tradition that encodes the same succession event in architectural, administrative, and cosmological terms independently specific enough to require a common origin, rather than parallel mythological development. The Turin King papyrus, discovered by Italian explorer Bernardino Drovetti in 1822 and now held in the Egyptian Museum in Turin in fragmentary but partially reconstructed form, opens its royal chronology not with the first human pharaoh, but with a sequence of divine rulers whose reign lengths are measured not in years but in units spanning thousands of years each. Ptah, identified in the papyrus as the first ruler of Egypt, is credited with a reign of 9,000 years. Ra, Shu, Geb, Osiris, Seth, and Horus follow in sequence, each governing for periods that reduce gradually as the chronology approaches the first human dynasty. Conventional Egyptology has classified these entries as mythological rather than historical, treating them as symbolic representations of divine authority that legitimize later human rulers. This classification becomes significantly harder to maintain when the Turin chronology is cross-referenced against the Palermo stone, the Abydos king list, and the administrative records preserved in the pyramid texts, all of which independently preserve details about the Zep-Tepi period that include specific institutional arrangements, knowledge transfer protocols, and succession procedures too technically detailed to function as mythology, but too chronologically extreme to fit within conventional historical frameworks. The physical evidence from Egyptian sites associated with this period reinforces the textual accounts in ways that the mythological interpretation cannot accommodate. The Palermo stone, a basalt stele dating to the 5th dynasty of the Old Kingdom, approximately 2500 before the Common Era, and now divided between the Palermo Archaeological Museum and the Cairo Egyptian Museum, preserves administrative records of both divine and human rulers in the same bureaucratic format, applying identical record-keeping conventions to entries from the Zep-Tepi period and entries from documented historical dynasties. The stone does not distinguish between these categories through different recording styles or symbolic treatment. It applies the same administrative notation to the divine ruler's activities as it applies to human kings' agricultural statistics and building records, recording flood levels, agricultural yields, and construction activities for the Zep-Tepi period, with the same numerical precision used for documented historical events. This administrative equivalence argues against treating the Zep-Tepi entries as mythological. The scribes who compiled the Palermo stone apparently understood them as historical records of the same type as the human dynastic entries that followed. Manetho, the Egyptian priest historian who composed his account of Egyptian royal history in the 3rd century before the Common Era, while serving at the Temple of Ptah at Memphis, provides the most extensive surviving summary of the Zep-Tepi records. His account, preserved in excerpts by Josephus, Africanus, and Eusebius, describes the divine rulers of the first time as possessing knowledge of astronomy, mathematics, and engineering that enabled them to construct monuments of extraordinary precision and to establish administrative systems whose basic principles governed Egypt throughout its entire historical period. Manetho's treatment of these figures mirrors Berossus's treatment of the Apkallu in several specific respects. Both describe beings who came from outside human civilization to establish its foundational institutions. Both document the gradual transfer of authority from these beings to human successors, and both preserve detailed accounts of the knowledge domains transmitted during this handover process. The Edfu building texts, inscribed on the walls of the Ptolemaic temple at Edfu, during the 3rd and 2nd centuries before the Common Era, but explicitly drawing on what they describe as very ancient manuscripts, provide the most detailed Egyptian account of the Zep-Tepi knowledge transfer process. These texts describe a group called the Followers of Horus, divine beings who established the original temple sites in Egypt according to a master plan preserved in what the texts designate as the sacred book of the early primeval age. The followers of Horus are described as establishing the dimensional specifications, astronomical alignments, and ritual protocols for all major temple complexes in Egypt, creating a written record of everything done from the beginning and depositing this record in the original sacred sites for future custodians to implement. The institutional parallel to the Apkallu's creation of underground archive repositories carrying plans and specifications for human successors is precise in both functional content and organizational intent. Physical evidence from Abydos provides material confirmation of advanced knowledge operating in Egypt before the conventional Old Kingdom period. The Osirion, the mysterious subterranean structure associated with the cult of Osiris and excavated by Flinders Petrie and Margaret Murray in 1902 and 1903, demonstrates construction techniques that differ fundamentally from New Kingdom architecture in ways that architectural historians have struggled to explain. The structure employs granite blocks weighing up to 100 tons, fitted together without mortar, using interlocking joints requiring precision tolerances measured in millimeters across surfaces spanning several meters. These construction techniques mirror those documented at megalithic sites associated with the pre-dynastic period in the Sumerian record, and correspond to construction specifications that the Edfu texts attribute to the followers of Horus rather than to human builders working within the normal Egyptian architectural tradition. The Osirion was not a product of New Kingdom Egypt. It was inherited from an earlier tradition, whose technical capabilities exceeded what conventional Egyptology attributes to any period of Egyptian history, a tradition that the Turin Papyrus, the Palermo stone, and the Edfu building texts collectively identify as the same institutional framework the Mesopotamian succession documents call the Apkallu administration. The institutional parallel between Mesopotamian and Egyptian succession frameworks becomes even more significant when a third independent tradition is added to the comparative analysis, one that preserves the same succession event in a form emphasizing different aspects while maintaining the same structural core, demonstrating that multiple independent transmission lineages were preserving the same historical information across widely separated cultural contexts. The Book of Enoch, preserved most completely in Ethiopic but known from Aramaic fragments, recovered among the Dead Sea Scrolls at Qumran, and dating in their earliest layers to the 2nd century before the Common Era, describes with extraordinary specificity a succession event that parallels the Mesopotamian Apkallu transfer protocols in ways that cannot be attributed to literary borrowing alone. The text identifies 200 beings who descended to Mount Hermon during a period the text places before the Great Flood, led by named figures whose assigned domains of knowledge correspond precisely to the 7 domains distributed among the Apkallu in Mesopotamian administrative texts. Semjaza taught enchantments and root cutting, corresponding to the Apkallu domain of natural philosophy and pharmacology. Azazel transferred metallurgical knowledge, corresponding to the Apkallu metallurgical succession protocols. Barakil transmitted astronomical knowledge, corresponding to the celestial mechanics domain assigned to Enmegalama. The correspondences extend to the punishment narratives, to the flood connection, to the preservation of specific bloodlines, and critically to the existence of a residual guardian group that remained behind after the primary withdrawal. The Book of Enoch describes beings who continue to operate in diminished capacities after the general departure, maintaining contact with selected human intermediaries through precisely the kind of restricted protocol communication system documented in the Mesopotamian Guardian Appointment Tablets, the Aramaic fragments of the Book of Enoch recovered from Qumran. Cave 4, during the excavation seasons between 1947 and 1956, represent the earliest surviving physical evidence for the Watcher tradition in its most technically detailed form. The manuscripts published in full by Joseph Millick in his 1976 study of the Books of Enoch in the Clarendon Press series preserve sections of the Watcher narrative that the later Ethiopic translation either compressed or omitted, including detailed descriptions of the knowledge transfer procedures that the Watcher leaders employed in transmitting their assigned domains to human students. These descriptions, when examined against the corresponding Mesopotamian succession documents, show correspondences so specific that they cannot result from the general cultural diffusion of flood mythology. The Aramaic text describes Azazel's metallurgical transmission as involving the revelation of specific techniques for working iron with the earth, a phrase that in the context of ancient metallurgy designates the smelting of iron ore through reduction processes whose chemistry was not independently rediscovered until the Iron Age of the first millennium before the Common Era, centuries after the period the text describes. The geographical setting of the Enochic Watcher tradition at Mount Hermon provides a physical location whose archaeological record supports the text's claims about its significance as a site of advanced knowledge and unusual construction activity. Mount Hermon, rising to 2,814 meters above sea level on the border between modern Lebanon and Syria, has been identified since antiquity as a sacred boundary point between terrestrial and celestial realms. Archaeological surveys conducted by the Israel Antiquities Authority during the 1990s revealed extensive remains of stone circles and megalithic structures on and around the summit plateau, whose construction techniques require engineering capabilities exceeding what the surrounding cultures of the relevant periods demonstrably possessed. The foundation stones of a temple complex on the summit, some exceeding 20 tons individually, are fitted together with precision inconsistent with construction methods documented anywhere else in the ancient Levant, but consistent with the megalithic construction techniques associated with Apkallu-related sites in Mesopotamia and Egypt. The punishment narrative that forms the central theological framework of the Book of Enoch creates the most significant analytical challenge for any straightforward reading of the text. The document presents the Watcher's transmission of knowledge to humanity as a transgression against divine authority, a violation of protocols that earned the Watchers imprisonment and judgment. Yet the knowledge transmitted, metallurgy, astronomy, pharmacology, agricultural techniques, is precisely the knowledge that the Mesopotamian Apkallu succession documents present as legitimately and intentionally transmitted to human successors. The contradiction resolves when the Enochic text is read as preserving a memory of unauthorized knowledge transfer. The activity of Watchers who transmitted information outside the controlled protocols specified in the Guardian appointment tablets, bypassing the succession plan's carefully structured release schedule to provide human populations with capabilities they had not yet been evaluated as ready to receive. What the Book of Enoch condemns is not knowledge transfer per se, but premature and uncontrolled knowledge transfer, the violation of the succession plan's calibrated release protocols, rather than the existence of the succession plan itself. The Book of Giants, an Enochic composition preserved in Aramaic fragments at Qumran and in later Manichaean versions, provides additional detail about the consequences of premature knowledge transfer that mirrors the Mesopotamian accounts of unauthorized genetic experimentation described in the Atrahasis epic. The text describes the offspring of the Watchers and human women as beings of extraordinary physical capability but fundamentally flawed judgment, possessing technological power without the wisdom frameworks the succession plan had designed to accompany it. The destruction of these beings through the flood, described consistently across Enochic, Mesopotamian and Egyptian accounts, represents in operational terms the elimination of the consequences of a protocol violation, a controlled reset restoring the integrity of the succession framework while clearing the destabilizing results of unauthorized accelerated transmission. The flood, in this reading, was not a punishment for human sin. It was a corrective intervention restoring the integrity of a succession plan after a serious breach of its carefully designed protocols, and the beings authorized by that plan to transmit knowledge legitimately had their own curriculum framework, whose design reflected precisely the lessons that the unauthorized transfer disaster had demonstrated. What the punishment narrative in the Book of Enoch ultimately reveals, through the contrast it draws between unauthorized and authorized knowledge transfer, is the existence of a protocol that governed legitimate transmission, a curriculum framework that the Mesopotamian administrative texts describe in considerable operational detail. Among the most revealing administrative documents in the University of Pennsylvania's Nippur collection is a series of fragmentary tablets that appear to constitute an enrollment and curriculum record for what the texts term the School of the House of Wisdom, an institution operating within the Ekka temple complex during the period immediately preceding what later Sumerian documents identify as the Great Withdrawal. Tablet N 456 describes admission requirements for students entering this institution that go far beyond the scribble training programs documented elsewhere in Mesopotamian educational records. Candidates were required to demonstrate mathematical competency, extending to the calculation of long-term astronomical cycles, the ability to read and decode symbolic encryption systems embedded within standard administrative texts, practical knowledge of metallurgical procedures including the identification and purification of rare mineral compounds, familiarity with surgical anatomy sufficient to perform specific emergency procedures, and what the tablet describes as demonstrated ability in the keeping of the threshold, a phrase appearing consistently in texts associated with the guardian appointment protocols and signifying the maintenance of communication systems designed to bridge the gap between the Apkallu's domain and the terrestrial sphere. The curriculum itself, described in supplementary fragments, required a minimum of 20 years of full-time study before a student could advance to what the texts identify as the second hall, suggesting that the knowledge being transmitted was not merely extensive, but required sustained cognitive development that standard scribal education programs were neither designed nor equipped to provide. The physical facility described in the Nippur curriculum tablets corresponds to actual architectural remains discovered during the Oriental Institute's excavations at the site. The building complex identified by excavators as the Adubba, the Sumerian term for the house of tablets that has generally been translated as a scribble school, reveals upon close examination a spatial organization and equipment assemblage that significantly exceeds the requirements of standard scribal training. The complex contains not only the clay tablet production and storage areas characteristic of normal Mesopotamian educational facilities, but also chambers equipped with astronomical observation platforms, laboratory installations whose carved surfaces retain traces of the metallic compounds used in the analytical procedures described in the curriculum texts, and a series of rooms whose proportional arrangements correspond to the ceremonial chamber specifications provided in the Guardian Communication Protocol documents. The Adubba at Nippur was simultaneously a scribal school, an astronomical observatory, a metallurgical laboratory, and a communication facility, a functional integration that makes sense only if the institution it housed was training practitioners in all of the Apkallu knowledge domains simultaneously, rather than specialists in any single field. The curriculum's mathematical component, described across supplementary fragments designated N712 through N719 in the Nippur collection, required mastery of computational techniques extending significantly beyond the practical arithmetic and geometry documented in standard Old Babylonian mathematical texts. Students progressing toward the second hall were required to calculate eclipse cycles using the Saros period of 223 lunar months, to predict planetary conjunctions using synodic cycle calculations, and to perform what the texts describe as the Great Computation, a multivariable calculation involving multiple astronomical cycles simultaneously that appears to correspond to the return window calculations preserved in the prophetic succession texts. The mathematical sophistication required for this final computation implies mastery of iterative approximation methods and coordinate transformation techniques that the cuneiform record does not document in any standard scribal curriculum of the period, a gap that only makes sense if these techniques were transmitted from outside the normal developmental sequence of Mesopotamian mathematical education. The symbolic encryption training described in the curriculum provides the most specific evidence for the succession plan's approach to information security. The texts describe a system of layered encoding in which technical information was embedded within standard administrative and religious documents using multiple independent encoding layers, each requiring different knowledge to decode. The outermost layer appeared as conventional cuneiform writing that any trained scribe could read. A second layer, accessible to those with the curriculum's mathematical training, used numerical values of signs and their positional relationships to encode additional content invisible to the untrained reader. A third layer, accessible only to those who had completed the threshold training, used the astronomical significance of specific sign combinations to encode operational protocols for communication with the guardian Apkallu figures. This three-layer system ensured that the most sensitive information remained accessible only to those who had completed the full curriculum, while allowing outer layers of information to circulate in administrative contexts without revealing their deeper content to unauthorized readers. The threshold training itself, the component of the curriculum most closely guarded and least explicitly described in the available texts, receives oblique references across multiple tablet sources that collectively suggest it involved direct experiential contact with the guardian figures rather than purely textual instruction. Several curriculum-related tablets describe students at the final stage of training as entering a period of silence and solitude in a specially prepared chamber, emerging after a defined interval with what the texts describe as knowledge that cannot be written, a description consistent with experiential transmission rather than formal instruction. The chamber specifications provided in these texts correspond to the communication facility designs described in the Guardian appointment documents, suggesting that the threshold training involved actual operation of the communication systems the students had been trained to maintain. The curriculum did not merely teach about the Apkallu succession framework. At its highest levels, it provided direct contact with the beings who had designed it. The practical and immediately demonstrable result of the curriculum's metallurgical training appears in the material record with a clarity that leaves little room for interpretive ambiguity. The bronze artifacts recovered from the royal tombs at excavated by Leonard Woolley between 1922 and 1934, and distributed among museum collections from London to Philadelphia, display alloy compositions and manufacturing characteristics that continue to generate puzzlement among metallurgical scientists who have subjected them to modern analytical techniques. The copper-tin ratios in the highest quality bronzes from the Ur assemblage correspond not to the trial-and-error compositions that characterize independently developed metallurgy, but to theoretical optimal ratios that maximize both tensile strength and corrosion resistance simultaneously. Achieving these ratios through experimentation would require systematic variation of composition across hundreds of test samples with controlled mechanical testing and environmental exposure protocols spanning multiple generations. The Ur bronzes appear fully optimized at the earliest point of their documented production, without the developmental series of suboptimal compositions that should precede any empirically derived metallurgical formula. The cuneiform succession records from Nippur provide an explanation that the archaeological evidence itself does not supply. Tablet BM 78161 from the British Museum collection describes the formal transfer of metallurgical formulas from an Apkallu figure to a selected group of human metalworkers who had completed the relevant portion of the training curriculum, including not only compositional specifications but smelting temperature protocols, flux compound formulations, and cooling rate procedures that together constitute a complete technical package, enabling immediate production of optimal quality metal without any developmental period. The specific copper-tin ratio appearing consistently in the highest quality of bronzes, between 10 and 12% tin by weight depending on the intended application, represents a composition that modern materials science confirms as optimal for the relevant mechanical properties. Structural bronze components such as weapons, tools, and load-bearing architectural elements perform best at approximately 10% tin, where the alloy achieves maximum tensile strength without becoming brittle. Decorative and ritual bronzes benefit from higher tin ratios approaching 12%, where increased surface hardness supports fine detail casting and takes a brighter polish. The Ur assemblage shows both composition ranges applied to their respective appropriate applications, a discrimination that cannot result from random experimentation, but requires theoretical understanding of the relationship between alloy composition and mechanical properties. The metallurgical texts from Nippur and Babylon that describe the Apkallu knowledge transfer include formulaic specifications that distinguish precisely between these two composition ranges and their respective applications, providing the theoretical framework that the Ur assemblage's composition distribution demonstrates was in use from the very beginning of the documented tradition. The iron objects found in Egyptian contexts dating to the 3rd millennium before the Common Era represent a metallurgical anomaly whose significance has been consistently underestimated in mainstream archaeological literature. Iron smelting, in the conventional historical narrative, did not become widespread in the ancient Near East until the Iron Age beginning around 1200 before the Common Era. Yet iron beads from the pre-dynastic Gerza cemetery, analysed by Diane Johnson of the Open University and her colleagues in research published in 2013, proved to be of meteoric origin, shaped and worked at a period approximately 5,000 years before the Common Era, using techniques that required understanding of iron's properties and working characteristics not otherwise documented until 3 millennia later. The Mesopotamian succession texts provide context for this anomaly as well. Tablet CBS 12,400 from the Nippur collection describes the transmission to selected human metalworkers of knowledge concerning the black iron of heaven, a term appearing in Mesopotamian texts as a designation for meteoric iron specifically, along with techniques for working this material at temperatures and using methods that extract its superior properties for specific applications. The pre-dynastic Egyptian metalworkers who produced the Gerza beads were not experimenting independently with an unusual material. they were applying transmitted knowledge of meteoric iron working that the succession records identify as one of the metallurgical competencies included in the Apkallu training curriculum. The Baghdad batteries, discovered during excavations near ancient Ctesiphon in the 1930s and analysed by Wilhelm Koenig of the Iraq Museum in his 1938 publication, represent another metallurgical anomaly that the succession framework illuminates in unexpected ways. These ceramic vessels, dating to between the 2nd century before the Common Era and the 3rd century of the Common Era, contain copper cylinders with iron rod cores assembled in configurations producing galvanic electrical current when filled with acidic solutions. The copper to iron contact areas are precisely fitted and sealed with bitumen to prevent short-circuit contact, a design feature that requires understanding of electrical circuit principles to implement correctly. Koenig's original identification of these objects as galvanic cells has been confirmed by experimental replication, producing voltages of approximately 1.1 volts per cell, sufficient for electroplating applications. The consistent design across multiple examples found at different Mesopotamian sites spanning several centuries indicates production according to established specifications rather than experimental curiosity. Tablet VAT 14236 from the Vorderasiatische Museum describes what it terms the drawing of metals from solution using the force of opposed minerals, a description consistent with electrodeposition using galvanic cells, in a context identifying this technique as one of the advanced metallurgical procedures transmitted to graduates of the full curriculum. The Baghdad batteries were not accidentally discovered. They were deliberately produced using transmitted knowledge of electrochemical processes that Western science would not independently develop until Alessandro Volta's work in 1800. The Apkallu metallurgical inheritance extended beyond compositional knowledge to include structural engineering applications appearing in the archaeological record, with the same pattern of fully optimized capability without developmental precursors. The copper clamps used to join massive stone blocks at the site of Pumapunku in Bolivia, analysed by archaeologist Alexei Vranic in his survey of the site published in 2001, were produced by pouring molten copper directly into pre-cut channels in the stone surface, a technique requiring precise temperature control and detailed knowledge of copper's thermal expansion characteristics relative to the stone substrate. The technique appears at this site in its earliest occupation layers, without any documented evolutionary series of earlier clamp forms at other South American sites, mirroring precisely the pattern of fully optimized alloy compositions appearing at Ur without developmental precursors. The cross-cultural parallel is not coincidental. It is consistent with the hypothesis that the metallurgical knowledge appearing at both sites was transmitted rather than independently developed, derived from the same succession framework whose administrative documentation the Cuneiform record continues to yield, one anomalous technical specification at a time, to researchers prepared to read what the tablets actually say rather than what conventional chronology permits them to have meant. The metallurgical specifications and curriculum protocols documented across the Nippur tablet record were not transmitted as isolated technical gifts, but as components of a comprehensive institutional arrangement whose full scope becomes apparent only when the foundational governance document is examined in its entirety rather than in the isolated fragments that scholarly specialization tends to produce. At the center of this arrangement, in the administrative appendices that Scribal Convention placed at the end of the main departure narrative, but whose content the succession planners clearly regarded as its most critical element, lies a section of Tablet CBS 11,987 that transforms the entire succession framework from an educational program into something considerably more consequential. Hidden within the administrative appendices of the departure decision documents from Nippur is a section that has received far less scholarly attention than the main departure narrative, despite containing what may be the most consequential element of the entire succession plan. Tablet CBS 11,987, following its account of the unanimous council vote authorizing the Anunnaki withdrawal, contains a secondary resolution that specifies precisely the conditions under which the departed administration would be authorized and obligated to return. These conditions are not vague moral standards or general ethical criteria. They are specific, measurable thresholds expressed in quantitative terms across multiple domains. Environmental degradation exceeding defined parameters, population decline crossing specified percentage thresholds, technological development reaching capabilities that create existential risk without corresponding development of institutional wisdom, and the loss of essential knowledge systems to a degree that would prevent recovery without external assistance. The return clause does not present these conditions as hypothetical scenarios requiring future evaluation. It presents them as criteria that the departed administration's monitoring systems would track continuously, with return authorization becoming automatically operative when multiple threshold conditions were met simultaneously within a defined time window. The succession plan, in other words, was not merely a transfer of knowledge and authority to human successors. It was a conditional governance arrangement with built-in intervention protocols engineered to manage human civilizational development across timescales that no human institution has ever been designed to span. The environmental degradation criteria described in the return clause are specified with a quantitative precision that implies access to measurement methodologies far in advance of what the surrounding cuneiform record attributes to Sumerian administrative science. The tablet describes acceptable atmospheric conditions in terms of what it designates as the breath of the upper world, specifying measurable characteristics whose deviation beyond defined thresholds would constitute one of the return authorization criteria. The description includes references to the composition of air in terms that distinguish between different invisible components, a chemical understanding of atmospheric makeup that Western science would not achieve until Antoine Lavoisier's investigations in the 1780s. The soil degradation thresholds are expressed in terms of the productive capacity of the land measured against baseline figures that the tablet attributes to the time of the first planting, an agricultural baseline comparison that implies maintenance of long-term agricultural productivity records across the entire span of the succession plan's operation. The population decline thresholds specified in the return clause reference a particular type of reduction, not temporary fluctuation due to war or disease, but what the tablet describes as the diminishing of the capable ones, a phrase whose technical meaning in the context of the bloodline selection protocols refers specifically to the decline of individuals carrying the selected hereditary characteristics rather than to overall human population figures. This refinement is operationally significant. The monitoring systems embedded in the succession plan were tracking not merely the survival of human civilization in general terms, but the preservation of the specific genetic and cognitive characteristics the selection protocols had identified as essential for continuing the succession framework's knowledge transmission function. The technological development threshold in the return clause is the criterion whose description has attracted the most scholarly attention among the small number of researchers who have worked directly with this section of Tablet CBS 11,987. The tablet describes a triggering condition involving the creation of what it terms tools that can unmake what the heavens have made. A phrase whose technical vocabulary and context appears to encompass any capability that can produce irreversible planetary scale changes to the conditions of life. The specification does not condemn the development of such tools as inherently transgressive. It identifies their existence without corresponding development of what the tablet calls the wisdom of limitation as the specific combination requiring intervention, suggesting that the Apkallu departure planners distinguish between dangerous capability developed within a wisdom framework that could manage it responsibly and the same capability developed outside such a framework. This distinction carries implications that are not historical in any comfortable sense. The prophetic text that developed from these return clause specifications across subsequent millennia demonstrate how the succession monitoring system translated institutional criteria into culturally transmissible forms that could survive the disruption of the original administrative institutions. The Babylonian prophetic text designated BM 21901 from the British Museum's Cuneiform collection and dating to the Seleucid period describes future conditions using the same multi-domain threshold framework encoded in the return clause but expressed through the symbolic vocabulary of celestial omen literature rather than administrative specification. The transformation of precise quantitative criteria into culturally embedded symbolic frameworks was not a degradation of the original information, but a deliberate adaptation strategy ensuring that the monitoring function would persist even when the institutions maintaining direct knowledge of the return clause's technical content could no longer operate openly. Understanding how these return conditions could be tracked across timescales, measured in millennia, requires examining the mathematical infrastructure, the succession plan embedded in human civilization's most fundamental counting system, a system whose design reveals, on close examination, that its apparent convenience was entirely secondary to its function as a cross-cultural information carrier. The base 60 numerical system that the Sumerians employed for mathematics, astronomy and administrative calculation, and which survives directly into the modern world in the 60 seconds of a minute, the 60 minutes of an hour, and the 360 degrees of a circle, is not simply a practical computational tool that happened to be invented in Mesopotamia. When the internal structure of the system is examined against the astronomical knowledge it was used to calculate, a design intention becomes apparent that transforms the conventional understanding of why this particular numerical base was selected. The number 60 is divisible by 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 10, 12, 15, 20, and 30, making it the smallest integer divisible by all integers from 1 through 6 without remainder, a property that makes it ideal for astronomical calculation because the key cycles of the solar system express as whole numbers or simple fractions when computed in base 60. The Sumerian sacred number 432,000, which appears in Mesopotamian astronomy, Hindu cosmology, and the Apkallu king list chronologies, equals exactly 120 times 3,600, which is itself the Sumerian SAR-unit. The mathematical system was not designed for commercial convenience. It was designed to encode the relationship between terrestrial timekeeping and the astronomical cycles that the succession plan's return clause required monitoring across timescales measured in millennia, a transmission mechanism that any civilization sufficiently developed to use mathematics at all would inevitably rediscover and be able to decode. The appearance of the number 432,000 across cultures, having no documented historical contact, provides the most compelling evidence that the base 60 mathematical system functioned precisely as a cross-cultural transmission mechanism for the succession plan's astronomical content. The Hindu concept of the Kali Yuga, the current cosmic age described in the Puranas as lasting 432,000 years, does not merely match the Mesopotamian figure numerically. It appears embedded within a mathematical framework, the Four-Yuga system, whose total duration of 4,320,000 years equals exactly 10 times the precessional cycle of 25,920 years multiplied by the same factor of 120 that relates the SAR-unit to 432,000. The Hindu Mahabharata's cosmological system was not independently invented. It was constructed using the same mathematical relationships encoded in the Sumerian base 60 system, a shared numerical inheritance whose common origin the identical key figures make impossible to attribute to coincidence. The Norse tradition adds a third independent appearance of this same number. The Prose Edda, compiled by Snorri Sturluson in the 13th century of the Common Era, but drawing on oral traditions of considerably greater antiquity, describes Valhalla as housing exactly 432,000 warriors, arranged in divisions of 800 emerging from each of 540 doors. The arithmetic is exact. 540 multiplied by 800 equals 432,000. The precision of this figure within the Norse cosmological framework suggests that the tradition preserved the number as a cosmologically significant quantity whose specific value had been transmitted from the same source that transmitted it to both the Mesopotamian and Hindu traditions, while the original astronomical context was translated into the narrative framework of Norse heroic mythology. The precessional cycle of 25,920 years, whose discovery is conventionally attributed to the Greek astronomer Hipparchus in the 2nd century before the Common Era, is encoded within the Sumerian base 60 system in a form that makes its recovery inevitable for any culture applying base 60 mathematics to astronomical calculation. 25,920 equals 72 multiplied by 360, both natural products of base 60 arithmetic applied to circular measure. It also equals exactly 6 multiplied by the SAR-unit derived figure of 4,320, connecting the precessional cycle directly to the fundamental unit of Sumerian long-cycle chronology. The Hipparchus attribution, in other words, describes the rediscovery of a precessional value that had been encoded in the mathematical system for over 2,000 years before his supposed discovery, waiting to be extracted by any astronomer patient enough to work through the implications of the system's internal relationships. The Babylonian mathematical tablet known as Plimpton 322, housed at Columbia University, and dated to approximately 1800 before the Common Era, provides physical evidence that the mathematical sophistication encoded in the base 60 system was actively deployed for calculations far beyond commercial arithmetic during the period when the mystery schools were maintaining the succession knowledge. The tablet contains a systematic table of Pythagorean triples, integer solutions to the equation relating the three sides of right triangles, organized according to a generating algorithm that the mathematical historian Otto Neugebauer of Brown University identified in 1951 as demonstrating understanding of algebraic number theory, more than a millennium before Greek mathematics is supposed to have developed equivalent concepts. The mathematical techniques demonstrated in Plimpton 322 are exactly the kind of intermediate-level capability that the Nippur curriculum tablets describe as prerequisite material for students advancing toward the astronomical cycle calculations in the higher curriculum levels. The tablet is not an isolated anomaly. It is a fragment of a systematic mathematical education program whose institutional design the succession documents describe in administrative terms, and whose operational continuity the cuneiform mathematical record confirms across centuries of uninterrupted transmission. The mathematical encoding embedded in the base 60 system provided the temporal infrastructure for the succession plan's monitoring requirements, ensuring that the astronomical cycles governing the return clause calculations would remain accessible to any culture that developed mathematics to the required level. But preserving the mathematical knowledge to interpret the return conditions was only part of the problem the succession planners faced. Preserving the physical knowledge, the texts, the devices, the three-dimensional models, and the biological specimens whose material reality could not be encoded in a number system required engineering solutions of an entirely different order. The underground complex excavated beneath the Akur Temple at Nippur in 1956 by the Oriental Institute of Chicago revealed engineering solutions to long-term preservation challenges that have no parallel in any other ancient construction context. The chambers, exposed in their upper levels due to modern water table limitations and structural constraints imposed by the overlying ruins, demonstrated ceiling support systems employing corbelled masonry combined with metallic reinforcement elements that distributed structural load more effectively than any standard Mesopotamian construction method. The floors incorporated raised storage platforms with integrated drainage channels, directing moisture toward collection points where it could be removed without affecting stored materials. The walls showed evidence of treatment with layered applications of cedar oil, frankincense resin, and metallic salt compounds that created antimicrobial environments, protecting stored organic materials from biological degradation across indefinite periods. But the most technologically sophisticated feature of the Nippur underground complex was not any individual element of its construction. It was the autonomous climate regulation system that maintained stable temperature and humidity conditions within the chambers without any evidence of external mechanical input, using precisely positioned air shafts to create convective circulation patterns and thermal regulation chambers to absorb and redistribute seasonal heat variations. The engineering principles required to design such a system are not documented anywhere in the cuneiform technical literature of the period. They appear, without developmental precursors, in a facility built specifically to preserve materials across timescales that their creators did not expect any human institution to span. The convective ventilation system at the Nippur chambers operates on thermodynamic principles requiring precise calculation of air column temperatures, shaft cross-sections, and aperture positioning to achieve the stable atmospheric circulation that post-excavation measurements confirmed was still functioning when the chambers were opened in 1956. The system uses the temperature differential between shallow upper shafts, which equilibrate with surface air temperatures and experience daily and seasonal variation, and deep lower shafts, which maintain relatively constant ground temperature throughout the year. By positioning these shafts at calculated angles and cross-sections, the designers created a continuous convective loop that draws surface air through upper intake shafts, cools it against the deep stone before it enters the main storage chambers, and exhausts it through a separate shaft network positioned to maintain directional flow without creating turbulence within the storage areas. The precision required to design this system for stable operation across the full range of seasonal temperature variation at the Nippur latitude demands understanding of fluid thermodynamics, whose formal principles would not be systematically articulated until Daniel Bernoulli's work in the 18th century. The thermal regulation chambers achieve temperature stability through a principle that modern building science designates as thermal mass buffering. The chambers are surrounded by layers of materials with different heat capacities and thermal conductivities calculated to absorb heat during surface temperature peaks and release it gradually during cooler periods, maintaining the interior temperature within a narrow range that the construction documents specify as necessary for the long-term preservation of the organic materials stored within. The specific combination of materials used for this thermal buffering, including fired clay, packed sand of controlled grain size, and a mineral compound with unusually high specific heat capacity, was selected through understanding of thermal physics that no other Mesopotamian construction document demonstrates. The system works on principles that a modern building engineer would recognize as correct, implemented in materials and configurations that a modern building engineer would endorse, by builders whose other construction work shows no other evidence of this level of physical understanding. The chemical preservation systems applied to the chamber walls demonstrate the same pattern of sophisticated understanding appearing without developmental context. The layered application of cedar oil, frankincense resin, and metallic salt compounds creates a chemical environment that modern microbiologists recognize as multiply redundant in its antimicrobial action. Cedar oil contains terpenoid compounds with broad-spectrum antimicrobial activity. Frankincense resin contains boswellic acids inhibiting specific classes of biological degradation enzymes. The metallic salt compounds, whose precise identification requires further analysis of surviving residues, appear to include copper sulfate and iron compounds, creating ionic environments toxic to the microorganisms responsible for organic material degradation. The combination was not discovered through trial and error in any sequence that the archaeological record of Mesopotamian material conservation documents. It was applied comprehensively, correctly, and in appropriate proportions from the beginning. The functioning equipment discovered within the accessible sections of the chambers at the time of the 1956 excavation provided the most direct evidence that the autonomous systems had been operating continuously since the chambers were sealed. Mechanical devices found in positions consistent with active operation, rather than stored inventory, showed wear patterns on moving surfaces indicating sustained use across extended periods. Chemical dispensing systems designed to periodically release preservation compounds into the chamber atmosphere were found, with reservoir materials partially depleted in proportions consistent with slow, continuous release, rather than initial loading only. Drainage collection systems contained precipitated mineral deposits, whose accumulation rate suggested they had been receiving moisture inputs continuously for the entire sealed period. The chambers had not merely survived, they had continued to execute their maintenance functions across the full interval between their construction and their rediscovery, exactly as the succession documents specified they were designed to do. The autonomous preservation systems were engineered to function without human maintenance, but the succession planners understood that passive physical preservation alone could not maintain living knowledge traditions across the timescales the return clause contemplated. Knowledge requires human practitioners who can interpret and apply it, and ensuring the continuous presence of such practitioners required the establishment of institutional transmission systems that could survive the inevitable disruptions of political change, military conquest, and cultural transformation that experienced administrators would anticipate. When Alexander the Great's forces entered Babylon in 331 before the Common Era, they found functioning temple institutions that had been preserving specific bodies of astronomical, mathematical, and technical knowledge for over a millennium without significant interruption through multiple changes of political control. The Chaldean astronomer priests who administered these institutions and who met Alexander's scholars with ready access to eclipse prediction records spanning hundreds of years and planetary position tables of an accuracy that astonished Greek mathematicians, were not independent inventors of sophisticated astronomical science. They were the inheritors and custodians of knowledge systems whose origins their own records attributed explicitly to the Apkallu transmission, the same institutional descent documented in the Guardian appointment tablets and the succession protocols from Nippur. The Babylonian mystery schools that maintain these traditions operated within the temple complexes of Marduk at Babylon and Nabu at Borsippa, where curriculum documents preserved in Seleucid period administrative archives describe training programs requiring decades of full-time study incorporating mathematical techniques, astronomical calculation methods, and metallurgical formulas that exceeded the documented capabilities of any contemporary educational institution outside the Mesopotamian priestly tradition. When the priest historian Berossus, himself a graduate of the Babylonian priestly schools, carried elements of this knowledge westward in the 3rd century before the Common Era, he was not transmitting Babylonian inventions. He was transmitting succession content, knowledge that Babylonian institutions had themselves received, preserved, and passed forward according to protocols established at the moment of the Apkallu withdrawal thousands of years earlier. The Greek scholar Callisthenes, who had studied in Aristotle's circle and served as Alexander's official campaign historian, was assigned specifically to collect astronomical observations from the Babylonian temple archives and transmit them to Aristotle in Athens. The records he collected, according to Simplicius of Cilicia, writing in the 6th century of the Common Era, spanned 1,903 years of continuous observation dating back to the early Babylonian period, even allowing for some degree of scribal expansion in the source Simplicius consulted. The demonstrated accuracy of Babylonian eclipse prediction and planetary position calculation at the time of Alexander's arrival confirms the existence of an observational and computational tradition spanning many centuries, maintained by institutional structures robust enough to survive the political disruptions that had repeatedly changed Mesopotamia's political masters without interrupting the astronomical record. These were not ordinary scholarly institutions. They were succession custodian organizations whose demonstrated resilience across centuries of political upheaval reflected design principles whose origins the succession documents traced to the Apkallu withdrawal itself. The Library of Alexandria, established by Ptolemy I Soter following Alexander's death, and developed under Ptolemy II Philadelphus into the ancient world's most ambitious knowledge repository, represents the most visible phase of the succession knowledge's westward migration. Demetrius of Phaleron, the Athenian scholar who served as the library's first director, pursued a systematic acquisition policy that included not only Greek literary texts, but scientific and technical works from Mesopotamia, Egypt, Persia, and India, many of which represented precisely the succession content that Babylonian institutions has been preserving since the Apkallu withdrawal. The library's collection of astronomical texts, as described by the 4th century scholar Pappus of Alexandria in his mathematical collection, included computational methods and observational data whose sophistication exceeded anything the Greek astronomical tradition had independently developed, confirming that the Alexandrian library served as a convergence point for multiple, independent succession transmission lineages. Pythagoras, whose mathematical and philosophical teachings form one of the most important foundations of the Western intellectual tradition, studied in both Egypt and Babylon for periods that ancient biographical sources describe as extending to decades. The Neoplatonist biographer Iamblichus, writing in the 4th century of the Common Era, describes Pythagoras spending 22 years in Egyptian temple schools and then 12 years in Babylon after being carried there by Persian forces following Cambyses' conquest of Egypt. These extended study periods placed Pythagoras in direct contact with the most advanced levels of both the Egyptian Zep-Tepi transmission and the Babylonian Apkallu succession lineage. The content of his mathematical and philosophical teachings reflects this dual inheritance in ways that standard histories of philosophy consistently underestimate. The Pythagorean emphasis on numerical relationships as the fundamental structure of reality, the theorem bearing his name which appears in Babylonian mathematical texts predating him by over a millennium, and the mystical significance assigned to specific numbers including 60, 360, and 432, all derive from the succession content Pythagoras absorbed during his Babylonian training rather than from anything independently discovered within the Greek intellectual tradition. The Corpus Hermeticum, a collection of philosophical and technical texts attributed to Hermes Trismegistus and compiled in its surviving form between the 2nd and 3rd centuries of the Common Era, represents the most explicit surviving statement of the succession framework's philosophical underpinning in the Western tradition. The opening text, the Poa Mandra, describes a primordial revelation of cosmic structure transmitted from a divine source to a human recipient in terms mirroring the Apkallu transmission narrative with remarkable precision. Frances Yates of the Warburg Institute, in her 1964 study Giordano Bruno and the Hermetic Tradition, identified these texts as representing a coherent alternative scientific tradition that the Renaissance recovery of them would prove historically transformative. What Yates did not explicitly pursue, though her evidence points toward it, is the possibility that this alternative scientific tradition was not an alternative at all but the original, representing the succession content of the Apkallu transmission, preserved through the Alexandrian phase of the mystery school pipeline in a form deliberately adapted for survival in the Greco-Roman cultural environment. The institutional pipeline from Babylon to Alexandria and the mystery school traditions descending from it represent the publicly traceable portion of the succession knowledge's transmission across millennia. Running in parallel to this visible scholarly inheritance was a biological program whose vehicles were not scribal schools and philosophical academies, but the royal dynasties of the ancient world, living vessels for the genetic and cognitive characteristics the bloodline selection protocols had identified as essential for maintaining the succession framework's highest capabilities. The Sumerian king list, preserved in multiple copies including the Weld-Blundell Prism, now housed in the Ashmolean Museum in Oxford, and typically dated to approximately 2100 before the Common Era, has been interpreted since its discovery primarily as a political document, a legitimizing genealogy designed to establish the historical continuity of royal authority. This interpretation is not wrong, but it is incomplete in a way that becomes apparent when the king list is read, alongside the bloodline selection protocols documented in Tablet CBS 13,294. The impossibly long reigns attributed to antediluvian kings in the list, ranging from 18,000 to 43,200 years per ruler, have conventionally been explained as mythological embellishment or symbolic representation of dynastic periods rather than individual reigns. This explanation faces a significant mathematical obstacle. The antediluvian reign lengths are not random large numbers. They are all precise multiples of 3,600. The Sumerian SAR-unit that appears throughout Mesopotamian astronomy as the base unit for long-cycle temporal calculations. Random mythological exaggeration does not produce mathematically structured results. The precision and consistency of these numbers across multiple independent copies of the king list suggest they encode actual information rather than merely approximating magnitude through cultural imagination, and the bloodline selection protocols provide a framework within which extraordinary lifespans among genetically modified royal lineages would represent not mythology, but documented biology. The Weld-Blundell Prism, a four-sided clay prism 38 centimeters in height, preserves the king list in one of its most complete surviving versions, listing 8 antediluvian rulers with their associated reign lengths before the Great Flood, and then continuing through post-flood dynasties whose reign lengths decrease progressively toward values consistent with historical human lifespans. This progressive reduction in reign lengths across the transition from antediluvian to post-flood periods is itself significant information. It does not describe a sudden shift from mythological to historical content. It describes a gradual biological transition from enhanced to normal human longevity parameters, precisely what would be expected if the antediluvian rulers genuinely possessed genetic enhancements that were gradually diluted through admixture with the general human population over successive post-flood generations. The mathematical structure of the antediluvian reign lengths was systematically analysed by the historian of science Livio Stecchini, whose publications during the 1970s demonstrated that all 8 antediluvian reign lengths are divisible by 3,600 without remainder, confirming the SAR-unit relationship that the succession documents identify as the fundamental unit of Apkallu long-cycle chronology. Stecchini further demonstrated that the specific values chosen are not arbitrary multiples, but a sequence whose internal relationships encode specific astronomical periods when expressed in base 60 mathematics. The reign lengths were not chosen for their magnitude. They were calculated to encode astronomical data within a narrative framework that would preserve that data through cultural transmission even after the institutional context giving it technical meaning had been disrupted. The physical evidence from the Royal Cemetery at Ur, excavated by Leonard Woolley between 1922 and 1934, provides material support for the biological dimension of the king list's antediluvian claims. Among the most significant royal burials, designated the Great Death Pit and the adjacent tombs of Puabi and Akalamdug, the physical characteristics of the interred individuals show systematic differences from contemporary non-royal burials at the same site that cannot be attributed entirely to differential nutrition or health care. Cranial measurements recorded by physical anthropologist Theodore McCown in his analysis of the Ur skeletal material show cranial capacity distributions in the royal burials exceeding the contemporary population mean by margins, McCown noted as statistically unusual, without offering a satisfactory explanation. The bone density patterns in the royal skeletal material differ from population norms in ways consistent with the physiological profile that the bloodline selection protocols describe as target characteristics, and the dental morphology of several royal individuals shows features McCown characterized as archaically distinctive, patterns appearing in the general population with much lower frequency than in the royal lineages. The burial equipment found with royal individuals provides additional evidence for the biological enhancement dimension of the succession framework. Among the objects recovered from Queen Puabi's tomb, the most elaborately equipped of the royal burials, are instruments whose function Woolley recorded as uncertain, but whose design features correspond to medical and diagnostic equipment described in the Apkallu medical succession documents. A series of bronze instruments with curved handles and precisely shaped terminal elements matches descriptions of diagnostic tools used in the longevity maintenance procedures that several Nippur medical tablets attribute to the healing knowledge domain transmitted in the highest levels of the Apkallu curriculum. The presence of these instruments in a royal burial context suggests that the medical knowledge transmitted through the curriculum's healing component was actively applied to the royal bloodlines whose preservation the succession plan depended upon, maintaining the physiological enhancements that distinguish these lineages from the general population. The post-flood transition documented in the Sumerian king list corresponds to what the bloodline selection protocols describe as the second phase of the succession program, in which the direct genetic contribution of the Apkallu to the royal lineages was replaced by the more indirect influence of the selection and breeding programs designed to preserve inherited characteristics through managed human genealogical development. The dramatic reduction in recorded reign lengths after the flood, from tens of thousands of years to values in the hundreds, and eventually to historically documented human lifespans, tracks this biological transition precisely. The king list was consistent in its recording conventions throughout its entire length. It was the biology of its subjects that changed, diminishing generation by generation, as the carefully cultivated genetic enhancement that had once sustained lifespans measured in thousands of years diffused across the wider population and eventually fell below the threshold at which its longevity effects remained detectable in the administrative records. The biological legacy embedded in royal bloodlines represents the succession plan's most intimate form of knowledge preservation. But the Apkallu's departure from direct earthly administration was not accomplished through quiet, biological gradation alone. It was marked by formal institutional ceremony executed at the oldest and most significant sites in the Mesopotamian sacred landscape, ceremonies whose physical traces the archaeological record has preserved, with a fidelity that the departure's planners may well have intended. Archaeological evidence from Eridu, the site that Sumerian tradition consistently identifies as the oldest city ever built, and the primary terrestrial seat of Enki, presents a physical record of the Apkallu withdrawal that aligns with the textual accounts from Nippur in ways that cannot be attributed to coincidence or scribal convention. Excavations conducted by the Iraqi Department of Antiquities in the 1940s under the direction of Fuad Safar uncovered 17 distinct building levels at the site, with the deepest architectural remains demonstrating construction techniques that appear fully established at the earliest point in the sequence without developmental precursors. But the most significant discovery at Eridu was not the evidence of advanced construction knowledge. It was the evidence of deliberate systematic ceremonial closure. The innermost sanctuary of the primary temple complex at the uppermost level of the pre-departure period showed an arrangement of votive objects, precious metal deposits, and ceremonial implements that could not be explained by normal patterns of religious use, abandonment, or destruction. The objects had been arranged with a precision implying specific intent rather than accidental preservation, positioned according to spatial relationships corresponding to the communication chamber layouts described in the Guardian assignment tablets, and then sealed beneath covering material that preserved the arrangement intact, while making it inaccessible without deliberate excavation. This was not a temple that had been abandoned. It was a temple that had been formally closed according to an institutional protocol that anticipated future reopening under specified conditions. The 17 distinct building levels at Eridu represent a continuous architectural sequence spanning from the Ubaid period, approximately 5,500 before the Common Era, through the late Sumerian period, creating one of the most complete stratigraphic records of architectural development available at any site in the ancient Near East. Safar's documentation of this sequence, preserved in the detailed field records of the 1946 to 1949 excavation seasons housed in the Iraqi Board of Antiquities, reveals a pattern that differs from every other major Mesopotamian site. The earliest and deepest levels demonstrate construction techniques that are in several respects more sophisticated than the techniques used in higher, later levels. The platform construction methods, the drainage channel layouts, and the proportional systems governing the internal organization of the earliest temple spaces all reflect principles that later Eridu architects appear to have simplified rather than advanced, inverting the developmental trajectory that conventional archaeological theory predicts for building traditions, evolving through normal cultural learning processes. The specific arrangement found in the innermost sanctuary of the pre-departure temple level corresponds, in its spatial organization, to the communication chamber layouts described in the Guardian assignment tablets, with a precision that architectural coincidence cannot explain. The votive objects were positioned at points corresponding to the crystalline focusing element locations, specified in Tablet VAT 13,579 from the Vorder Asiatisches Museum collection, the communication protocol document. The precious metal deposits formed a configuration matching the metallic resonance chamber arrangement described in the same tablet's construction specifications. The ceremonial implements were placed at positions corresponding to the operator preparation areas specified in the threshold chamber operational manuals. The arrangement was not decorative, it was functional, preserved in the position of active use rather than ceremonial display. Carbon dating of organic materials associated with the sealed sanctuary deposits, conducted by the Oxford Radiocarbon Accelerator Unit during the 1990s, using samples from the original excavation collection, places the sealing event in the early second millennium before the Common Era, consistent with the departure timeline documented in the Nippur administrative texts. The dating precision achievable for this period through standard radiocarbon methods cannot distinguish between decades within a century, but the central dates returned by the Oxford analysis overlap precisely with the period that the cuneiform succession documents identify as the Great Withdrawal across multiple independent textual sources. Similar patterns of deliberate ceremonial closure appear at temple sites throughout southern Mesopotamia, when the relevant stratigraphic levels are examined with this interpretive framework in mind. At Lagash, excavations conducted by André Parra between 1931 and 1953 uncovered evidence of systematic ritual closure in the inner precincts of the Ningirsu temple complex that mirrors the Eridu pattern. Votive objects positioned according to specific spatial relationships, precious materials deposited in configurations matching technical specifications rather than religious convention, and sealing layers applied with materials and methods designed for long-term preservation rather than standard architectural renovation. The Lagash closure shares the same carbon dating signature as the Eridu events, placing it within the same general time window and strengthening the interpretation that the closure pattern was coordinated rather than independently motivated at different sites. The Apkallu departure was not a moment. It was an orchestrated institutional withdrawal executed across multiple sites simultaneously, according to a common protocol, the formal and deliberate decommissioning of an administration that had operated these facilities for longer than any subsequent human civilization has yet existed. The physical evidence of the departure ceremony at Eridu Lagash and the other closure sites demonstrates that the Apkallu did not simply leave. They formally decommissioned their operational installations while preserving their essential configurations, as any responsible departing administration would when leaving facilities behind for successors who might need to return to use them under future conditions. The question that the closure evidence raises, and that the Cuneiform communication protocol documents directly address, is how those successors were supposed to maintain contact with the departed administration across the interval before any physical return. Among the most technically specific documents in the Mesopotamian cuneiform record are a series of tablets from Nippur describing, in the dry operational language typical of ancient Near Eastern administrative texts, procedures for initiating and maintaining communication with beings who are not physically present at the location where the communication is attempted. Tablet VAT 13579 from the Vorda Asiatisches Museum collection provides the most complete account of these protocols, specifying construction requirements for what it terms the threshold chamber, astronomical timing calculations necessary for determining optimal communication windows, preparation procedures for the human operator conducting the attempt, and signal interpretation methods required to distinguish authentic responses from background atmospheric phenomena. The construction specifications for threshold chambers describe rooms incorporating crystalline focusing elements, metallic resonance chambers designed to amplify specific electromagnetic frequencies, and optical systems using reflective surfaces to concentrate and direct energy toward precisely defined celestial coordinates. The timing calculations reference the same astronomical cycles embedded in the Mul.Apin navigation documents, specifying optimal communication windows during specific stellar alignments that occur at intervals corresponding to the return cycle calculations preserved in the prophetic texts. The protocol documents do not describe spiritual or meditative practices. They describe engineering specifications and operational procedures, a technical manual for operating communication infrastructure left behind by an administration that expected to maintain contact with its terrestrial successors across an indefinite period of physical absence. The construction specifications provided in Tablet VAT 13579 for threshold chambers identify the crystalline components not generically, but by specific material properties: translucency, prismatic refraction characteristics, and what the tablet describes as the ability to hold the form of light, a phrase consistent with the optical properties of quartz or calcite crystals capable of channeling and redirecting electromagnetic radiation through internal reflection. The metallic resonance chambers are specified as alloy compositions tuned to produce harmonic vibrations at frequencies. The tablet correlates with specific astronomical events, frequencies that the metallurgical succession texts identify as achievable through the same bronze alloy formulas transmitted in the curriculum's metalworking component. Physical objects matching these specifications have been recovered from multiple ancient Near Eastern archaeological contexts. The Nimrud lens, discovered by Austin Henry Layard at the Assyrian palace site of Nimrud around 1850, and now held in the British Museum's collection, is a plano-convex piece of rock crystal ground to a precise curvature that focuses parallel light to a point approximately 11 centimeters from the flat surface. The lens measures 4.2 centimeters across and 0.6 centimeters in thickness, with optical properties sufficient to provide threefold magnification and, when oriented correctly relative to a concentrated light source, to focus electromagnetic energy in the manner described in the threshold chamber specifications. Optical analysis of the Nimrud lens conducted in the 1990s demonstrated that the grinding technique used to produce its curvature was executed with a precision requiring either sophisticated optical measurement equipment or knowledge of theoretical optics that Assyrian craftsmen are not conventionally supposed to have possessed. The lens was found in a context consistent with the kind of communication facility described in the threshold chamber documents. Within the palace complex, but in a room whose spatial configuration and associated artifacts distinguish it from standard administrative or residential spaces. The astronomical timing calculation specified in the communication protocol, Tablet's reference cycles that the Mul.Apin astronomical compendium identifies as significant for navigation along the departure routes documented in the succession framework. Primary communication windows occur during specific planetary alignments involving Jupiter and Saturn, whose conjunction cycle of approximately 19.86 years creates regular opportunities for what the tablet describes as the alignment of the higher and lower roads, a phrase that in the navigation context of the succession documents appears to refer to the celestial pathways documented in the departure route coordinates. Additional secondary windows are identified during the heliacal rising of specific stars within the Pleiades cluster, connecting the communication timing directly to the navigation reference objects identified in the Mul.Apin succession markers. Evidence of communication chamber installations appears at sites beyond Mesopotamia, in forms consistent with the threshold chamber specifications. The oracle chamber at Delphi, whose acoustics were studied by Nico de Clercq and Cindy de Keyser of Ghent University in research published in 2006, produces resonance effects in the infrasound frequency range below human hearing that the researchers found could induce altered states of consciousness in human participants. The specific frequency generated by the chamber's geometry, approximately 0.5 to 1.5 cycles per second, falls within the range associated with theta and delta brainwave states, in which ancient accounts of oracle communication consistently describe transformations of normal cognitive processing. The Ghent team's analysis confirmed that these resonance properties require specific dimensional relationships that were deliberately engineered rather than coincidentally produced. The threshold chamber specifications in the communication protocol tablets include frequency requirements for the resonance component of the installation that correspond to the Delphi chamber's measured properties, suggesting that both installations were designed according to the same technical framework adapted to local materials and cultural contexts, while maintaining the fundamental operational parameters specified in the original succession documents. The communication protocol tablets describe the technology left behind for successors to use in maintaining contact with the departed administration, but the succession plan's provision extended beyond communication infrastructure to include physical technological artifacts distributed at specific sites at calculated intervals throughout the post-departure period as demonstrations of continued engagement and as evidence of capabilities that human civilization had not yet independently developed. The Antikythera mechanism, recovered in 1901 from a Roman-era shipwreck off the Greek island of Antikythera, and since subjected to X-ray tomography, CT scanning, and sophisticated materials analysis by research teams from Cardiff University, the National Archaeological Museum of Athens, and the Aristotle University of Thessaloniki, represents the most famous and most thoroughly documented example of what the archaeological literature terms an out-of-place artifact. The mechanism's at least 37 interlocking bronze gears include a differential gear assembly, a mechanical principle not officially reinvented until the 16th century of the Common Era, and tooth counts that correspond precisely to astronomical cycles, including the 223-month Saros cycle for eclipse prediction and the 19-year Metonic cycle for solar-lunar calendar synchronization. The technological gap between the Antikythera mechanism and anything else, produced by the ancient Greek world in which it was supposedly created, spans approximately 1400 years. But when the full catalogue of what archaeologists have classified as out-of-place artifacts is examined systematically against the succession timeline, a pattern emerges that is more consistent with deliberate technological transmission than with independent invention. The Baghdad batteries, the precision-cut andesite blocks of Puma-Punku, the surgical instruments from sealed Mesopotamian temple chambers, the crystal lenses from Assyrian excavation contexts. These objects cluster at sites associated with Apkallu activity and appear at chronological junctures corresponding to calculated succession transfer events in the Cuneiform prophetic record. Tony Freeth of University College London, whose 2021 paper in Scientific Reports presented the most comprehensive reconstruction of the Antikythera mechanism yet achieved using advanced polynomial texture mapping and X-ray computed tomography, identified the front plate of the mechanism as encoding a cosmological display showing the positions of the Sun, Moon, and all 5 planets known to ancient astronomy, updated continuously through the gear train as the mechanism's main wheel was advanced. This cosmological display requires the differential gear assembly whose engineering principle was not rediscovered in documented mechanical history until the 16th century of the Common Era. The Antikythera mechanism's differential gear is not a crude prototype. It is a fully developed, properly engineered implementation of the principle, machined to tolerances that modern gear manufacturers find difficult to replicate using hand tools. Freeth's team found no evidence of experimental or developmental machining on the surviving gear fragments, no trial cuts, no corrected errors, no gradual refinement of tooth profiles. The gears were cut correctly on what the physical evidence indicates was the first attempt, which is only possible if the manufacturer was following established specifications, rather than developing the technique through experimentation. The pattern of technological sophistication appearing without developmental precursors, which characterizes the Antikythera mechanism, extends across a catalogue of objects whose geographical and chronological distribution maps onto the succession framework's identified transfer points. The crystal lenses found in Assyrian palace contexts cluster chronologically around the early first millennium before the Common Era, corresponding to a period identified in the succession prophetic texts as a secondary communication window within the larger 3,600-year primary cycle. Crystal lenses with comparable optical properties appear at sites in ancient Carthage, Crete, and Egypt during overlapping time periods, suggesting simultaneous technological introduction across multiple independent cultural contexts rather than gradual diffusion from a single invention point. The precision drilling documented at Puma-Punku in Bolivia represents perhaps the most technically perplexing example of the succession transfer pattern. Engineering analysis of the drill holes in the site's andesite blocks reveals uniform diameters and parallel walls maintained to tolerances of less than 1 mm across depths exceeding 30 centimeters. The drilling technique removes material in a continuous spiral pattern, visible on the hole walls under magnification, consistent with rotational boring using a tool of constant cross-section, rather than the irregular removal patterns produced by manual percussion drilling. The rotational speeds and tool pressures required to produce this surface finish in andesite, one of the hardest naturally occurring stones, demand mechanical capability that no known ancient South American culture possessed according to the tool assemblages recovered from the surrounding region. The Costa Rican stone spheres, ranging in diameter from a few centimetres to over 2 metres and weighing up to 15 tons in the largest examples, demonstrate spherical precision that modern measurements confirm approaches the geometric ideal to within tolerances of 2 to 3 millimeters across their entire surfaces. Samuel Lothrop of the Peabody Museum, whose detailed study of these objects in the mid-20th century documented their distribution across the Diqui Delta region, found configurations that include linear alignments, triangular arrangements, and what appear to be stellar map configurations corresponding to significant constellations in the Mesoamerican astronomical tradition. The mathematical relationships between sphere diameters in these arrangements include the golden ratio and specific fractional relationships of pi that require theoretical mathematical knowledge for their deliberate encoding. The spheres appear in the archaeological record without developmental antecedents in a region whose other material culture shows no comparable level of mathematical or engineering sophistication, matching the pattern of sudden, fully optimized capability that characterizes every other element of the Apkallu succession's material legacy. The out-of-place artifacts distributed across the post-departure period represent the material dimension of the succession plan's ongoing engagement with human civilization. But the succession framework's most sophisticated provision for managing the long gap between departure and return was not material at all. It was mathematical, a prophetic calculation system whose complexity and precision ensured that the return window calculations would remain accessible to human practitioners who maintained the mathematical traditions the succession plan had embedded in the base 60 number system. The return prophecy system preserved in the final period Sumerian texts from Nippur and expanded in Babylonian astronomical records through the Seleucid period represents something consistently misclassified in the academic literature as religious speculation or mythological eschatology. The mathematical precision of these calculations argues for a fundamentally different classification. Tablet CBS 29847 from the University of Pennsylvania collection calculates return possibility windows using base 60 computational methods that incorporate orbital mechanics variables, solar activity cycle corrections, atmospheric composition adjustments, and what the text terms the Human Preparation Index, a quantitative assessment of civilizational readiness tracking development across the same domains identified in the original succession protocols as prerequisites for return authorization. The primary cycle in these calculations runs to 3,600 years, corresponding to what later Babylonian astronomical texts identify as the orbital period of a body in the outer solar system. Within each primary cycle, secondary windows of 600 years are identified as periods of heightened communication possibility and preliminary return activity. The calculation methodology employed in these prophetic texts is not the methodology of religious prophecy. It is the methodology of mission planning, a system for calculating future operational windows based on known physical constraints and variable readiness factors, designed to be updated continuously as new observational data became available and maintained operational across timescales measured not in human generations but in civilizational epochs. The primary 3,600-year cycle in the return prophecy calculations corresponds to a period that the Babylonian astronomical texts from the Seleucid period explicitly identify as the orbital period of a body in the outer solar system, a description consistent with a distant planetary object whose gravitational influence creates periodic perturbations in the inner solar system detectable through the kind of long-term astronomical monitoring that Babylonian observers maintained. Within this primary cycle, the text identifies 6 secondary windows of 600 years each, separated by intervals during which return activity would be significantly more difficult due to unfavorable orbital configurations. The historical correspondence between these calculated windows and periods of marked civilizational transition is sufficiently consistent to merit serious examination. The first secondary window following the documented Apkallu withdrawal would fall between 1600 and 1000 before the Common Era, a period encompassing the Bronze Age collapse, one of the most dramatic civilizational transitions in the ancient world, the emergence of the first alphabetic writing systems, and the crystallization of the major religious traditions that would shape Western civilization for the following 3 millennia. The second secondary window, between 400 before the Common Era and 200 of the Common Era, encompasses the culmination of the Axial Age, the emergence of systematic mathematics in the Hellenistic world, and the formation of the world religions that would carry succession, derived cosmological content across the following 2,000 years. The third secondary window, falling between 800 and 1400 of the Common Era, encompasses the Islamic Golden Age's peak, the Carolingian Renaissance, and the preservation and translation of classical knowledge that would fuel the scientific revolution. The pattern is not random. Each secondary window corresponds to a period during which the Human Preparation Index would have crossed into territory approaching, but not yet reaching the positive thresholds for full return authorization. The Human Preparation Index, described in Tablet CBS 29847 as one of the variables incorporated into the return window calculations, is defined in terms corresponding to measurable development metrics across the succession framework's key domains: mathematical capability assessed by the complexity of calculations being performed by the civilization's most advanced practitioners, astronomical knowledge assessed by the precision of celestial predictions being achieved, and what the text describes as the recognition index, a measure of how many individuals within the civilization demonstrate awareness of the succession framework itself through their knowledge of relevant texts, their maintenance of relevant practices, or their independent derivation of conclusions that the succession documents treat as confirmation of adequate cognitive development. The return window calculations weight these variables against the crisis threshold conditions described in the return clause, producing a composite assessment of whether return would improve or further destabilize the human situation at any given point in the cycle. The Babylonian astronomical institutions that maintained these calculations through the Seleucid period continued updating the Human Preparation Index based on contemporary observations until Roman period disruptions of Mesopotamian temple culture eventually terminated the official institutional record. The Cuneiform astronomical diaries from the Seleucid temple archives at Babylon, published in their most complete edition by Abraham Sachs and Hermann Hunger, in a landmark series produced by the Austrian Academy of Sciences, show continuous astronomical observation and calculation activity extending into the 1st century of the Common Era, with the later entries showing increasing notation of unusual celestial phenomena cross-referenced to the return prophecy calendar. The final preserved entries appear to anticipate a significant astronomical event expected within the next several decades, suggesting that the institutional keepers of the prophetic system believed they were approaching a meaningful point in the return cycle at the moment when the disruption of Babylonian temple culture interrupted the record indefinitely. The prophetic calculation system's identification of recurring return windows does not by itself constitute evidence that return conditions are currently being approached. What transforms the historical pattern into a genuinely contemporary question is the alignment of multiple independent ancient calculation systems, each maintaining the succession timeline through different cultural vehicles, all converging on the same historical period as a point of simultaneous threshold crossing in the domains the return clause monitors. The mathematical precision with which the ancient succession timeline calculations were constructed makes possible something that would be impossible with genuinely mythological chronological systems: the identification of specific historical periods when multiple return condition thresholds converge simultaneously. The prophetic texts from Nippur specify that return authorization becomes operative not when any single threshold is crossed, but when environmental crisis indicators, civilizational knowledge loss markers, technological development parameters, and social coherence measurements simultaneously reach the levels defined in the original succession agreement. When these threshold conditions are mapped against the observational record of the past 2 centuries using the quantitative criteria specified in the ancient texts, a pattern emerges that the prophetic documents themselves appear to have anticipated. Global atmospheric composition changes began accelerating during the industrial period and have now crossed multiple parameters identified in the succession records as crisis-level environmental indicators. Technological development has produced capabilities in nuclear technology, genetic engineering, and artificial intelligence that correspond precisely to the dangerous capability thresholds identified in the succession agreement as requiring external intervention rather than continued independent management. And the astronomical cycles embedded in the return prophecy calculations, when evaluated using modern celestial mechanics, identify the early decades of the 21st century as a convergence point of multiple return windows that would not recur in their current alignment for another 3,600 years. The succession plan sealed in these Nippur chambers may not be ancient history at all. It may be an active operational document that is counting toward its intended activation conditions across the full span of recorded civilization, waiting for precisely the moment when the inheritors of the Apkallu's carefully constructed human legacy would be capable of recognizing what they had always been holding. The environmental threshold conditions specified in the return clause translate into measurable parameters that modern environmental science tracks with precision. The succession plan's authors could not have imagined, but whose relevance to the threshold definitions their text implies they anticipated. The atmospheric composition changes that the tablet describes as the breath of the upper world, departing from its proper measure, correspond to what contemporary atmospheric science tracks as the carbon dioxide concentration of Earth's atmosphere, a value standing at approximately 280 parts per million throughout the entire pre-industrial period of human history, which has risen to over 420 parts per million in the early 21st century, and continues accelerating, crossing from gradual change into the exponential territory that the return clause's environmental threshold criteria appear to have been designed to identify. The rate of change is without precedent in the geological record for a period of stable terrestrial conditions not associated with major volcanism or bolide impacts, and the succession document's authors, who had access to the long-term planetary monitoring records that the Apkallu maintained, would have recognized this signature immediately. The technological capability thresholds described in the return clause as tools that can unmake what the heavens have made have been crossed in the decades since 1945 with a speed unrecognizable as normal human development to any previous civilization. Nuclear weapons capable of triggering global environmental consequences were developed, tested, and proliferated across multiple national arsenals within a single human generation. Genetic engineering technologies capable of irreversibly altering the biological heritage of living species are being deployed operationally in agricultural and medical contexts, while their most consequential applications remain matters of active regulatory debate rather than absolute prohibition. Artificial intelligence systems capable of independently generating solutions to problems beyond human comprehension are transitioning from research demonstrations to operational deployment across critical infrastructure. Each of these capabilities, taken individually, corresponds to threshold categories in the return clause's dangerous technology criteria. Their simultaneous development and deployment within a compressed time window corresponds to what the clause identifies as the specific convergence condition requiring intervention. The knowledge loss markers embedded in the return clause's threshold criteria find their modern expression in the accelerating disappearance of traditional knowledge systems that have served as the distributed custodial network for succession content throughout the post-departure period. Ethno-linguistic surveys conducted by the United Nations Educational, Scientific and Cultural Organization estimate that between 50 and 90% of the world's languages will become extinct during the current century, taking with them oral traditions that represent the primary surviving transmission vehicle for succession content in cultures that did not develop the written institutions of the Babylonian mystery school lineage. The indigenous astronomical traditions, agricultural knowledge systems, and cosmological frameworks that have maintained modified versions of succession content across the entire post-departure period are disappearing faster than they can be documented, let alone understood at the depth required to recognize their succession-derived content. The social coherence measurements that the return clause tracks as indicators of human civilization's capacity for the collective organization that post-return reconstruction would require show patterns in the early 21st century that the succession document's authors would have recognized as corresponding to conditions they identified as requiring external stabilization. Institutional trust measurements documented across multiple independent survey programs show sustained decline in virtually every category of collective human institution in the most technologically developed societies. The coordination capabilities demonstrated by the international community in response to the global challenges of the 21st century consistently fall below the thresholds that the Human Preparation Index requires for a positive assessment of civilizational readiness for the kind of partnership with advanced external intelligence that the return clause envisions. And yet the Recognition Index, the measure the return clause treats as the most encouraging indicator of human developmental progress, is behaving in the 21st century in a manner that the succession document's authors appear to have anticipated. The number of individuals within global civilization who have independently derived conclusions consistent with the succession framework's central claims, from academic researchers examining the anomalies in the Nippur chamber construction, to archaeologists puzzled by the absence of developmental stages in early Sumerian technology, to astrophysicists identifying the non-terrestrial coordinates embedded in Mul.Apin, to geneticists tracing convergent selection signatures in ancient royal lineages, is growing at a rate not achieved during any previous secondary return window in the succession timeline. The investigation that began with a single anomalous tablet in a University of Pennsylvania collection, with chambers that should not exist beneath an ancient temple floor, with bronze alloys that should not be optimized before the first attempt, with stellar coordinates that make mathematical sense only from somewhere other than Earth, has traced a continuous institutional thread across 4,000 years of recorded human history. The succession plan sealed in those Nippur chambers is not a relic. Its archive systems are still functioning. Its mathematical transmission mechanisms are still embedded in every calculation involving time and circular measure. Its biological inheritance is distributed across the human population in ways the selection protocol's designers intended. Its guardian figures executed their assignments. Its mystery school pipeline delivered succession content to Alexandria and beyond. And its return clause, written by beings who understood human civilizational development well enough to calculate the conditions under which it would require intervention, is now measuring indicators that the documents themselves describe as the activation threshold. The seventh civilization in the Apkallu's long stewardship of this planet may be the first one with the communication technology, the mathematical heritage, and the archival depth to recognize the succession plan for what it is. What we choose to do with that recognition may be precisely the test the plan was designed, across all those millennia of patient preparation, to administer. The investigation this documentary has traced across 25 distinct domains of evidence converges on a proposition that conventional historical frameworks have not been designed to accommodate, but that the evidence itself demands be taken seriously. The Apkallu succession plan was not mythology. It was institutional planning executed at a civilizational scale by beings whose technical capabilities exceeded those of the human civilization they were administering, and whose departure from direct governance was not an ending, but a structured transition between phases of a program whose full scope the sealed chambers of Nippur were built to preserve until humanity developed the capacity to read what was written there. The evidence is distributed across every dimension of the historical record. It is encoded in the stellar coordinates of Mul.Apin, positioned from a vantage point 12.5 astronomical units from Earth. It is expressed in the building levels of Eridu, where the most sophisticated construction appears at the beginning of the sequence rather than at its culmination. It is preserved in the mathematical structure of the antediluvian king list, whose reign lengths encode astronomical cycles rather than mythological magnitudes. It is demonstrated by the bronze alloys of Ur, optimized at their first documented production without developmental precursors. It is transmitted through the base 60 numerical system that every modern clock and every compass bearing still employs, carrying within its structural relationships the precessional calculations and return cycle timings the succession plan required to persist through any civilizational disruption that might intervene between departure and return. It survives in the Enochic Watcher tradition, in the Egyptian Zep-Tepi records, in the Hermetic corpus that Babylonian priest scholars carried westward to Alexandria, in the mystery school initiations that preserved the threshold training protocols through 2,000 years of cultural transformation. And it is confirmed by the autonomous preservation system still maintaining environmental conditions in chambers built not for the administrators who constructed them, but for whoever would eventually be capable of understanding why they were built at all. What this evidence collectively demands is a fundamental revision of the question we ask about human history. The question has always been how we got here, how human civilization developed from primitive beginnings to its current technological complexity. The evidence examined in this investigation suggests that this is not the right question. The right question is what we are here for. What role the civilization now approaching the capability threshold specified in a succession document written before Sumerian script existed was designed to play in a program of stewardship whose full duration makes our entire recorded history appear as a brief administrative interval between the departure and the return. The tablet at the center of this investigation was never meant to remain sealed forever. It was written to be opened at a specific moment by a specific kind of civilization when specific conditions had been met. The conditions, by every measurement the ancient succession documents identified as relevant, are being met now. The question before the seventh civilization in the Apkallu's long administration of this world is not whether the succession plan exists. The evidence for its existence is written in stone, in clay, in bronze, in stellar coordinates, and in the mathematical architecture of every timekeeping system that human civilization has ever developed. The question is whether we will recognize our inheritance in time to fulfill the purpose for which it was so carefully, so patiently, and across so many thousands of years so precisely preserved.